Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Was Reborn as the Vigilante Fox? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Izuku Midoriya was presumed dead on July 25th. The boy's 5th birthday was the last day he was ever seen by those who cared about him. It had been 8 years since then. 8 years since he'd been known, 8 years since he'd been cared about, 8 years since he'd been loved. 8 years since his mother had lost her precious baby boy. She didn't last much longer after that. Izuku had only found that out after he found her tombstone at 11 next to the empty one with his name beside it. Was it his name still? He hadn't been referred by it in years. Can a name no longer be yours if you distance yourself from it long enough? Or does it follow you like a badly kept secret, always 2 steps behind, always ready to pounce, always keeping you just on the edge of panic until you run yourself ragged trying to catch it? He supposes he will find out one day. For now he's taken the name back, an act of rebellion, he supposes. But what happens when the past comes to bite him when he least expects it? You can't change the past, only plan for the future. Cute sentiment, sure, but when the past projects onto your future, sticking and staying and refusing to budge no matter how hard you try to scrub like an inky stain, it starts to feel impossible to move on. Not like he should be able to move on, he'd done too much. Was he even his mama's little boy anymore? His mother told him to be nice. His mother told him to be generous and hopeful and compassionate. He would have to go apologize to her grave soon. He hasn't been anything to be proud of since he was 5, no matter how much he tried to make people be proud of him. He had been surrounded by the wrong people for too long. His father seemed to be like that. She wouldn't like what he's doing right now. He was sat in the rafters of a so-called abandoned warehouse. It was filled with a few low-level villains who have access to some pretty good tech with awful security for it. Now he didn't need the tech exactly, but he had been getting bored since his radio broke and he wanted to fix it. He doesn't get much entertainment all right. Besides, they were probably going to use it for villainous things anyway, and so he was technically doing a good thing. Careful, he might want to stretch before reaching that far. Anyways, the 8 guys inside the warehouse seemed to be waiting for someone or something as they paced back and forth around the warehouse or were playing cards on the table in the corner. They all seemed to be wearing some sort of mask over their faces. They were all different shapes. Seems like someone's got a brand. Ah yes, the most important part of being a villain, looking like you're going to a Halloween party. Well, that fits for certain heroes too, doesn't it? Izuku could hear a truck start to pull into the front of the warehouse, and the guys inside stood up at attention towards the door. Well, that's a good distraction. Now Izuku has never really been a fan of stealing. He doesn't like doing actions that make him seem villainous after the multiple lectures from his favorite detective about how much trouble he can get in. But when you're alone and an orphan and legally dead and legally quirkless, you do what you can to get by. What is he going to do anyway? The little visually impaired kid can easily say he didn't mean to steal. He can't even see most stuff. He prefers to just let people think he's fully blind. He can get away with more that way. He was probably going to give that detective guy a migraine one of these days. He crawled across the rafters as slowly as he could to not cause any noise that could give away his as he turned up his hearing to focus on the group on the ground. They were strangely silent as they stood on each side of the door, their heads staying straight ahead as he jumped silently down into the corner behind some boxes they had set up. Boxes full of scraps they'd gotten from God knows where. Though the tracking wristbands they had could be nice. The radio wasn't too busted, but he could also take more for good measure. They are villains anyway, so what would they care? He grabbed a few of the wristbands as well as some other scrap metal they had lying around. He knew that one of them had to have a technology quirk because villain support tech went for good money to the right person. He would have gone down that route if he didn't get so guilty at the thought of it. He didn't want to make his ma'am too disappointed in him. He was stuffing the ratty old backpack he had brought with him full of anything he could get his hands on when he heard the doors open and about 6 heartbeats tied together and muffled screaming. Oh shit. He walked into a kidnapping, didn't he? He shrank down behind the boxes again as the 6 bodies were brought into the middle of the room. He's made a mistake, hasn't he? He could easily slip away and not get caught and not get stuck into hero stuff. Again. But then again, no heroes were coming. And he was here. And there was a kid stuck in that pile of 6. Soft crying was erupting behind the beat of LD as whispers of comfort and pleas to be silent were exchanged by the people around him. Pleads that were not heeded quick enough for his captors as he found a sharp kick into his stomach and a hand finding a grip into his hair to drag him out of the pile. A sharp nod from the ringleader was all the accomplices needed to start ripping BLNDFLDs off. Fear and panic radiating from their faces as they watched helplessly at the gun pressed into the young boy's temple. They were all panicking. They were really FING panicking. He can't leave them here. He can't do nothing. You're all going to stay nice and quiet, alright? This guy even sounds like an arsehole. Izuku can sit in his little abandoned building and build his little machines as he ignores the shouts down on the streets. It's cowardly, yes, but he doubts many people would want him to run around helping people if they knew how weak he really was. Though in this moment, when people are in trouble and the smoky, known too well, odor of the guns wafts past his head, his weakness seems to evaporate to the back of his mind. Locked away deep where it will only resurface when he's alone and panicking and most vulnerable for it to strike. He doesn't like being vulnerable. He doesn't like a lot of things, honestly. He especially doesn't like bullies. He's had his fair share in his short life and in his current predicament. He can tell the guy with a gun to a 10-year-old's head isn't going to hold back. Adrenaline, his old friend, comes rushing back like always. Next time he goes to steal from someone, he's going to make sure it isn't a bunch of villains. He's trying to lay low for goodness sakes. Speaking of laying low, Izuku will admit he has, well had, he probably still does, a pretty recognizable face. Since being recognized in any capacity by people like these is the complete opposite of his goals, he probably should just sneak out, right? Call the heroes. Be an upstanding citizen. He was stealing a mask from their box as he thought about that. They had a pretty good selection. Some of them had ridges, and others had ear-like structures on the top. One had horns. Not like he has the right to be picky. He picked up the first one he could get his hands on that would be secure over his face and tied it on, loosing his little remaining vision as he did so. The kidnappers hadn't noticed him yet, but how long would that take? They didn't seem like complete and utter idiots, which is a step up from a lot of villains and heroes, cough cough, from around this area. Not like there were many heroes in this part of Mizudafu anyway. Too much paranoia and too little limelight. No time to dwell on that anyway. He looked over what he had in his pockets. A switchblade, you can never be too careful. A smoke bomb, that thing costs a lot. He needs to learn how to make his own. His keys, they aren't going to be of much use. And finally, what he was looking for, his blowgun. Well, that didn't come off how he intended. He rolled out how many darts he had left. They were coated in a poison of his own design, intended to paralyze and slightly harm but nothing too lethal. That was a line he wasn't a fan of crossing. He only had 6 left, DMN. There were about 9 guys currently in the warehouse, not including the kidnapping victims, and about 3 more in the van outside. He would have to be careful with the darts then. He was very much outnumbered here. He made sure the thin hoodie he was wearing was zipped up as he tied back his far too outgrown hair. He needed it cut soon, and took a breath. He listened to the breathing in and out of the people around him, of the blood rushing through their veins and the hearts which were beating faster than others in some but all of which had an increased speed. Hopefully some of these guys are flight sort of people. He grabbed his hood and covered his hair with it before standing up. He took his blowgun and inserted a dart into it, careful to do it the right way. He's made that mistake before, and then took it up to his mouth. The ringleader with the gun to the kids' heads found himself passed out on the floor with a new puncture wound in his neck soon after. Then, with all the worry of a plan gone wrong, Izuku found about a dozen guns pointed right at him. He always was a showstopper. A dramatic little beach, he was referred to once. Why don't we all take a little breath? He started before he found the faint footsteps sneaking up behind him, deciding to gain their confidence and try to whack him on the side of the head. Or not. He finished as he grabbed the man's wrist and threw him over his shoulder, kicking his gun away into the far corner. He took the man into a strong headlock before giving his attention back to the other men. They weren't shooting? Strange. He should have been either almost dying and trying to hide behind anything he could get his hands on, or well, Swiss cheese. Yet he was fine. They seemed scared even. A small shake of a hand here, a shuffle in their stance there. They didn't want to shoot. He can work with that. He spared a look at the kid who was still crawling backwards and nodded at him to run. He turned around before he could see what he did, but he could hear it, not that they needed to know that. And who are you supposed to be? One of the original 8 inside the warehouse has broken ranks to grab his boss's unconscious. He hopes he's unconscious body. His voice came out in a rough but seemingly hushed tone. There was a lot of strain in his voice. Maybe he has a voice quirk of some kind. Izuku could only hope this guy shared the others' qualms about shooting. Why they weren't, though, was still a mystery. Just someone who knows holding back your quirk like that can't be nice. It was a shot in the dark, really, a hope that the small tether he could latch onto would be the right one. Luckily, the speaker's hands started fidgeting after he heard that, and his heartbeat started to increase. Telltale sign someone is nervous. Gotcha. Although, of course, you are wanting to keep silent right now, I can see why. You are surrounded by multiple housing complexes, and someone would have to alert at least the cops. And alerting the heroes in the area of a potential fight wouldn't be helpful in the slightest. That must be why you're all so hesitant to shoot. Gunshots are incredibly loud. Trust me, I would know. Although that does ask the question, why are you kidnapping people in the first place if not for ransom or attention? He will admit he had started muttering halfway through his spiel, but as he held the unconscious body between his fingers, he had started to get too confident. He barely noticed the guy sneaking out of position until he was a couple of feet from him. Luckily for Izuku, though, he scuffed his shoe on the last step and left a harmless noise to most but a guttural scratch to someone's ears as sensitive as his. The dart found its way into the guy's eye socket before Izuku even realized what he was doing. A loud thud was left in his wake as he dropped. He was seemingly a large guy if the mutterings of a bear afterwards were anything to go off of. Maybe his mask was a bear, and all these guys took on code names based on the animal they masqueraded as? What do you want? The ringleader's voice was wavering despite the tone becoming more aggressive. He was getting scared, probably not expecting any fighting. Rookie mistake, really. You should be ready to expect anything, no matter how outlandish. He really shouldn't judge. He has absolutely no plan here. The whispers of voices miles away started creeping into his ears. A hero was coming. They were about 12 minutes out if the hero didn't have a speed quirk. He needed to get out of here. That was shockingly quick. The nearest hero he could see was about 3 miles away, and yet the kid had gotten to him in a matter of minutes. He must have had a speed quirk or something. Speaking of quirks, the 5 kidnapping victims remaining all had some sort of mutation. A hair of fire on one, a shark quirk on another. They all seemingly had pretty powerful quirks. Probably some sort of tell for people they wanted to kidnap. I'm just trying to help. It's not very nice to take people without their permission. Consent is key, my guy. At the hero's current pace, he would be here in 10 minutes. Time to be an annoying little sheet. So you think you're funny, do you, arsehole? Oh, so this guy has anger issues. The remaining 6 kidnappers were shuffling where they stood. How new were these guys to kidnapping if they were this anxious about not even killing him? Or maybe they were anxious about killing him, and that's why he was still alive. How annoyed could he make this guy before the hero showed up? 9 minutes left. I've been told I'm actually quite funny, thank you very much, and I know when people are lying. I'm very observant. Like how you kidnapped only people with strong quirks? Wonder why that is. It did make him wonder, actually. That wasn't pure stalling. Izuku isn't unaware of the kidnapping and trafficking going on in the world, but he also knows of the quirkism that goes through their heads. People with stronger and especially visibly stronger quirks were far less likely to be taken, as it was seen as more of a hassle. Yet they had taken only those with strong quirks. It was a strong contradiction from the norm. Maybe he's thinking too much into this. He's been too understimulated for a while anyway. You don't know what you're messing with, Fox. Oh, so he's wearing a fox mask. Ironic. He highly doubts this kidnapper is the worst villain Izuku will have met. He'd meet 100 of this asshat before having to go back to his old life. Even if he wasn't as bored back then. Care to enlighten me, or are you just going to keep on being cryptic as hell? Do you even know what you're messing with, or am I just talking to a middleman? Another stutter in his heart. This is getting fun. 5 minutes left. If he is working for some kind of unknown person, then there could be a background kind of villain who wants people specifically with strong quirks. Or he is just being dumb like usual, and they aren't related. He always did take things like this too far. His boredom seemingly seeping into every part of his mind until it uncovered some kind of gold, some kind of glistening stone that could free him from his existential problem of nothingness in his head. Even if that glistening stone was truly just a piece of coal that he had convinced himself was important. He really just can't trust his own mind sometimes. You should have stayed home, Fox. He had enough malice in his newly found name that he was half convinced Izuku had murdered this guy's whole family. He was riling this guy up enough that his increasing volume would hopefully tip off the hero of where exactly they were. This guy was basically doing his job for him, except this conversation was starting to cause some of them to slip their attention away from him. He couldn't risk that. I ain't got many places to go, but if you're offering me a way out, I'd suggest you take your own advice. He pointed his thumb up to the shadow-encased corner up in the rafters of the warehouse. Luckily enough, the kidnappers were paranoid enough to immediately aim their guns up at where he was pointing. Idiots. He brought the blowgun to his lips and aimed at the speaker's neck in the hope the others would be too shocked to get another to rally up again. The hero was only 3 minutes away anyway. The mystery speaker had annoyingly fast reflexes, though. The dart was shot off its course by a smack from the gun before getting squished under his foot like a bug. That was just mean. Oh, come on, dude, those were hard to get. His whiny voice was easy to muster up when he was actually upset. Those chemicals had cost a lot, really. His favorite childish voice, which somehow got the speaker to waver in his merciless staring down of the barrel of his gun straight into where Izuku's defective eyes should be. Had he not realized Izuku was a kid yet? Childishness was an easy enough layer to throw on top of his shell to push away the questions from hitting too deep. If he couldn't be recognized as childlike at first glance, he may be losing his touch. The inevitable loss of his innocence is a problem for another time, damn it. He needed to find something else to defend himself with. The darts were effective but limited. The hero was about 2 minutes out, and he was about a minute from finding a piece of metal lodged into his cranium. The sound of the bullet leaving its muzzle whistled through his eardrums as the bullet tagged his ear cartilage, leaving a cold, bloody hole behind it as he ducked and swerved behind some of the boxes to his side in an attempt to hide the rapidly closing up hole. He felt his own skin rearranging and reconnecting with itself to create an amalgamation of what once was until it settled back into his ear. An ear attached to a body with too many scars and injuries he acquired too early for his newly fast-acting regeneration quirk to counteract. A sharp pain shot out through his stomach as his head started to sway in protest to his lack of energy. Quirk drawbacks were stupid. Couldn't the quirk doomsday theory hurry up already? The speaker was shouting to his fellow villains to get the rats out of here, and that he'd deal with the fox. The guy must have caught onto the gunshot being loud enough to alert any person within 10 miles, like the hero who was only about 30 seconds away at this point. He could play this stupid game of hide and seek, but the deadly addition, until the hero got here and left the mess to him. He didn't seem to have much backup except for the police cars too many miles out to be of any real help except for carting the villains away. He could always try and slash their tires or, in other ways, distract them so they couldn't get the kidnappees away. That would be an even bigger problem, and he didn't need being a useless nuisance with his vigilante charges. Only one thing is worse than being a vigilante who can't even do that right. Vigilantes who can't even be vigilantes properly are the ones that end up squashed on the bottom of an alleyway or bleeding under someone's fist or snapping and deciding to murder people. The hero silently sneaked onto the rafters, overtaking Izuku's previous spot that he had been sitting in for about an hour as he waited for an opening. He had a lot of time to kill. Izuku stopped himself from looking up at him, keeping his head steeled forward towards the speaker as his anger started to grow. His arms throwing the gun around the room at a frantic speed. shouts being thrown around the warehouse from the speaker and the 6 masked guys trying to haul the kidnappees and the 3 unconscious bodies he had caused out of the warehouse. Probably none the wiser as the hero moved across the rafters towards the entrance. He was probably planning on dropping down and fighting the 6 while they were distracted. Smart plan if the speaker wasn't ready to shoot at anybody at a moment's notice. He slipped the switchblade out of his pocket before zipping the pocket back up, snapping the blade out of its cover before holding it up to aim at the speaker's gun. He reeled his arm back and threw the knife at the barrel of the gun. A loud crash echoed through the warehouse. The kidnappers and the hero turned to look as the gun was knocked out of his hand and flew across the warehouse. Izuku slid out from behind the boxes and ran towards the speaker. He threw a punch at the speaker's temple in an attempt to get him out cold before the speaker grabbed hold of his hair and used it to throw him over to the side. He tucked his head and covered it with his arms when he fell to the ground. He paid a moment's attention to the hero. He had a strange long scarf he was using to take down and restrain the other villains. Maybe he had a quirk like Best Jeanist. He must have been an underground hero because Izuku spent a lot of his unlimited free time paying attention to the local daylight hero fights, occasionally using them as a distraction to get away with stealing some stuff he needs, and he'd never seen a guy like this before. He was very smart, though. He was taking down those villains quickly and efficiently. Izuku sat up and then fell back onto his hands as he swept out the speaker's legs. He got up onto his feet as the speaker fell onto the ground. The speaker fell badly onto his head, and blood started to drip onto the ground from the side of the mask. He looked up at Izuku as his fists started to ball before he ripped his mask off and opened his mouth to scream. Izuku's hands instinctively went to his ears as he dropped his hearing sense to as low as he could, his sense of touch becoming almost unbearably high. He could feel every touch of air like a slap against his skin as he kept his body stiff in anticipation. Before, when the speaker was seemingly holding back on his quirk, he was still able to get pretty loud. Izuku didn't want his ears to be as especially sensitive as they are when this guy let loose. Then he noticed that nothing was coming out of his mouth. Confusion spilt off from Izuku as the scarf came straight to the kidnapper and wrapped around his mouth and arms. The speaker got dragged off into the pile of kidnappers that the hero had counted up in the time Izuku had dealt with one of them. He must have had a good control of his quirk, whatever it is. He ran off back to his boxes to pick back up his backpack. It didn't really dawn on him how much vigilantism he was doing until everyone was already down. He has been arrested before, but he gave a fake name and got himself off with just a warning when they found out about the blind thing. He doesn't know how he keeps getting away with getting arrested and getting off, but if it's keeping him out of trouble and Izuku Midoriya is legally dead, he's not so fussed. This guy doesn't strike him as the type to back down on a vigilante. He seems like the type to drag him kicking and screaming to a police station and get him an ankle tracker and realize that he'd been lying about his name and get him no longer legally dead on the police records. Police records that would easily leak to people who would be more than happy to send out thousands to find him. There were 2 doors out of the warehouse, the one the kid had run out of and the one the hero was currently standing by with the kidnappers. The hero had called the police to come pick the villains up, so he could probably slip out of the faraway door if he was quick enough. Easy peasy. All right, Fox, you want to be nice and come to the station? So that's his name set in stone, then. So he can't sneak away with this guy's focus on him. His original assessment of his quirk didn't take into account that he could seemingly stop others' quirks from working. Even temporarily, that is not a power to be underestimated. Would it work on all of Izuku's quirks or just one of them? How long could he keep a quirk erased? Is there a way to get it back while he is keeping it erased? Can he use the quirks he erases? He stopped his mind from steering any closer to that line of thought. He had to think worst-case scenario. That this hero could erase all of his quirks indefinitely and use them against him. If he could do that, Izuku would probably be down for the count. Sure, he could keep on fighting this guy, but if the fight drew on with his quirks still erased, his regeneration couldn't keep working on his body. From the pain he pushed down constantly encircling his nerves, he knew his quirk was always at work, and he couldn't risk stopping it for even a minute. Judging by the fact his quirk wasn't erased yet, this hero probably needs some kind of visual on him to erase his quirk. The villain whose quirk he erased hadn't even been paying attention to him, so the cause couldn't have been something done by the erased. It had to have been the eraser. That's a shame. Izuku's vision was already pretty fed, and this mask really wasn't helping. So he needed to get out of here quickly without letting the hero get a visual on him. He didn't want to shoot a dart in case it really did hit true and cause the hero to pass out. Then the villains could get control of the situation again before the cops got here. The soft footsteps of an overly cautious hero moved towards him at a slow enough speed it could be seen as non-threatening. Too bad Izuku took everything as threatening. Take that, hero. He moved to his knees to stifle going through the boxes easier. A desperate attempt to find something that could get him out of this situation that, by the grace of everyone up above, worked. His hand grasped around a large tarp folded nicely into a square. His hand went down the layers to check the side, and from the size of it, he knew if it was thrown at the right time, it could completely cover the man's vision. So he would have to throw it at the right time, wouldn't he? He was 3 seconds away. Then 2. Then 1. Blankness washed over his body for half a second as he came into the hero's vision, followed by an agonizing pain deep under his chest until he got the hero's eyes covered by the tarp, which was actually a lot bigger than he expected. It had not only covered his body but wrapped it on itself as it took over a lot of the ground. Good luck to him getting that thing off. Izuku jumped up and over the boxes he was previously hidden under. A flip he would have normally done when running away for pure dramatic flair was denied due to the sheer pain running through his body. He would have kept on running if it wasn't for the scarf the hero had shooting out towards him as it freed itself from the tarp. He jumped up and then fell to the side. The scarf was relentless in its attacks towards him despite the hero's eyes still being covered. Did it work on its own, or did he have to know where it was going? He rolled to the side, and the scarf continued grasping at the thin air. He ran over to the far corner of the warehouse where his knife had fallen next to the gun. He picked both up and turned around quick enough to see the scarf shooting right towards him. He reeled his arm back and threw the gun straight into the tarp where the hero was on the verge of getting out of. That took less time than he thought. It hadn't even been a minute since he threw the tarp on. He heard a wince as the gun collided into the hero's head and caused him to fall face first into the ground, which toppled onto the scarf as it dropped to the ground. Izuku took the opportunity and grabbed a hold of the limp scarf before running to the pile of kidnappers and wrapping it around them. When the hero came back from the hit to the head a few seconds later, his scarf tensed and then came back towards him, dragging the pile of villains with it. When the hero had gotten his eyes free from the tarp a few moments later, the fox had already run from the scene of the crime with only a laugh left behind drifting through the wind. He kept on running through the dark and desolate streets until the wind battered his face and the pain in his lungs made him push through to make it finally crack in his brain that he's alive, that he's there in this world and not the next. That the feeling of his own body splintering and eating itself was not there anymore. That it had only been there in the few seconds his quirk was gone. It had been gone. His quirk being erased even for a few seconds had sent a shock through his system that had awoken an old pain deep inside his system. He hadn't been without a quirk since he was 9. Before that, not since he was 4. Let's just say your body isn't meant to gain then lose multiple quirks. Especially not that young. Your body will compensate and grow to accommodate such powers as they flood into your bloodstream and give it upgrades after upgrades as quirks are added relentlessly despite your begging that it's enough. Bodies don't want to die. So they adapt. They evolve. Then when they are taken but the evolutions are left, the body will be confused. Like when the immune system fights its own body due to it being seen as a threat. The quirks are a buffer which keeps the adaptations from collapsing in on one another and fighting. When a buffer is lost, the fighters will start going all out. Like Izuku found out at 9 years old when he felt his own body rot with no abilities to stop it. If he hadn't acquired his regeneration quirk, then likely the body would have eaten itself. He needed to find out who this hero was and stay far, far away from them. Even a moment of harmless quirk erasure for him could mean Izuku smelling that rotting feeling that haunts his nightmares again. He ducked into an alleyway a few blocks from his home. The panting fell out of him involuntarily, and his head rested onto the wet and cold brick wall beside him. His hands found themselves reaching into the nearby dumpster in a desperate attempt at getting some food. Food fuels his regen. After all, he has higher nutrition needs than the average person, which just made his malnutrition problems worse. He struck gold as he pulled out a pack of beef jerky still sealed. Thank whatever JRK threw away perfectly good food because he had ripped into that pack before even having a second or first look at the expiry date. It was all gone before he realized it was 4 days out of date. He sighed as he fiddled with the straps of the mask he was wearing. Now that his small field of vision was returned to him, he could see the mask in its full glory. It was light orange and black with short ears on the top and a sanded-down bottom ridge which left everything below his nose exposed to the world. It wasn't that much of a problem, really. He could eat in the mask since his mouth was exposed, and if he ran into a deaf person, it would be easier for them to read his lips. He's visually impaired. Okay, his sign language needs work. It had only dawned on him as he sat on the soaked floor of a dark alleyway a few minutes' walk from the abandoned apartment complex he calls home that he was actually considering the mask's long-term uses. Did he really need to think about that? After all, the small acts of vigilantism he had done before were spur-of-the-moment, adrenaline-induced actions that he ran away from and only thought of with fond memory until he had done enough thievery and lookout jobs for cheap cash that they became silent, washed-over paintings in a gallery of villainy. He couldn't really do this long-term. Could he? Izuku Midoriya always dreamed of being a hero. Those dreams had been crushed so many times that the thought was an amalgamation of awful actions and deaths that were his fault. Did being a vigilante really count as being a hero, though? He had heard about some vigilantes a couple of years ago, but that was only because his father had stolen one of their quirks. Since they had dropped the Vigilante Act and become pros, though, vigilantism seemingly only had a bad reputation everywhere in society. He really couldn't be a vigilante. Not only would it draw unwanted attention, but if one onlooker took a look under the mask and put together who he was, or if a villain was able to recognize his voice that really hadn't dropped yet, then his little life would be over. The life he had gotten someone killed to have a chance at would be swept under the rug as another one of his little rebellions. So he really should just throw the mask away. Take his stolen stuff and go back up to his solitary home. Take it easy and keep on living in the shadows of society. He stood up and walked over to the dumpster. What would have happened if he wasn't there tonight? Would those people have died? Would that kid have gotten shot, or would he have just been thrown back into the pile of people that got kidnapped and were never seen again? He had helped people, hadn't he? He had done something good. He wasn't even thanked, and yet he loved doing it. Could he keep doing this? He hugged his mask to his chest. He would have to be very careful. He would have to wear gloves to cover his fingerprints and try his best not to talk in front of villains. He would have to hide from that erasing hero and not get caught for having multiple quirks. He could do that, though, couldn't he? He had been hiding since he was 11, and if he did this, he could help people. Inko would be proud of that, wouldn't she? He stuffed the mask back into his backpack. He was going to help people. He bit back a smile as he walked out of the alleyway, his hands gripping onto his backpack as tight as they normally did when he was at the home stretch. His ears listening out for any sign of movement like they did every time he had come back here since he found the building abandoned and with no sign of reopening after the Muzutafu earthquake when he was 11. It was perfectly fine for use, he thinks, so it's really just recycling the waste left from people. He is a good person sometimes. The 0 yen rent was just a much-loved benefit. His keys jangled as loud as they normally did when he took them out. He had covered the 2 keys he actually had with far too many keychains to make it almost impossible to get them out of his own pockets, never mind if someone tried pickpocketing him. He didn't have enough money to worry about losing his wallet, but he'd be screwed if he lost his keys. He really only had his apartment right now, and it cost a lot to get the key to the building in the first place. He pushed open the heavy door to the building, the cold air inside settling into his bones as it always had. He pushed it back shut and locked it quickly before moving over to the stairs. Some days he very much regretted picking a room not on the bottom floor, but he had his reasons. If the lights and sound started showing on pedestrian levels, then questions would get asked, and he might have gotten kicked out due to it being seen as a danger to his safety. The building had only stayed up this long because the owner had died in the earthquake and the government decided the building would cost less money to keep up than it would to tear it down. Izuku didn't care for the reasons they kept the building up, as long as he got to live in the calm, cold and pretty, structurally sound apartment, he was happy. He took the stairs 2 at a time, ignoring the sharp pain in the pit of his stomach, until he got to the 3rd of the 5 floors. This floor coincided with the tops of many of the buildings, so the few lights he did make were brushed off as just coming from the rooftops. He likes to believe he isn't a complete and utter idiot. He used his second key to open room. He ignored the pillow fort he had made on the couch in the winter of his first year on his own when the cold started getting to him, and he was afraid of any more fire than just his small lighter. His hand found the bottle of painkillers he keeps when the pain gets too much, his fingers struggling to get the cap open due to their own shaking. He sat down on the ground before discarding the lid next to him on the small rug he had saved up for. 2 pills left the bottle and went down his throat, his forehead resting against the counter until his head stopped swimming. The out-of-date beef jerky hadn't filled the empty pit in his stomach where his pain splintered off through his every nerve. He had planned to get more food for his apartment after the tech thievery. Due to his redirections, he was left in a barren apartment, with an insatiable ache in his bones and a deep-seated fear of a hero he hadn't known existed this morning. His legs protested as he dragged himself to the small desk he had for himself, covered in batteries and a ripped-open toaster he fidgeted with when he was bored. He opened his laptop and leaned as close to the screen as he could. His visual impairments hadn't made him entirely blind, but his peripheral vision was non-existent. His tiny field of vision had annoyed him for years, but he can work with it for research. If he was going to start being a vigilante, then he'd have to know what he was doing. To start with, he should look into the more underground heroes. Emphasis on the erasing hero who could seemingly kill him even accidentally with a look. So he went searching, bypassing the Limelight hero forums in search of some kind of word about Quirk erasing. Even if this hero had tried his best to stay out of the media, the reporters are like vultures who will fight and search and scratch at any coal they can find in the hopes of a small story getting them known. Then he found an article about a UA student. A UA student who got into the hero course during his first-year sports festival. An admirable feat for anyone, but this student didn't have a flashy quirk. In fact, he fought people seemingly quirkless. His quirk was written as erasure. If he looked at someone, he could erase their quirks until he blinked or otherwise lost his sight on them. The article hadn't mentioned his scarf, but he would find something eventually. He had a lot of time to kill before he could go outside. Alright, Shoyudaizawa, how can he permanently ignore your existence? Izuku loved the sun. The light warmth that blankets over his skin as he walks aimlessly through his life. It was always better than the darkness of night or the clouded sky in winter. He might be biased. Deprivation makes you love something more once you get it back, after all. A light smile brushed over his features as he walked down the bustling streets of Mizudafu. It was around 5 p.m. when he had dragged himself out of the apartment to go out. At this time of day, his baby-faced appearance wouldn't be given a second look between the likes of people coming home from a long day at work and teenagers just free from school and able to make havoc on the streets and back alleys. He pushed up his sunglasses as he got his shoulder shoved into again for the 4th time that day, sorries being exchanged before they moved on and off with their lives. Izuku has always loved people watching. What if they were mothers of children taken too soon? See their half-sibling they didn't know existed? Going to buy food for their multiple pet snakes? An undercover hero who had to watch their partner die in their arms when they could have saved them? Point being, Izuku likes to use his subpar mind to create far too exaggerated stories of people based on only their faces. It gives meaning to his incredibly boring life at times. Wonder what Eraserhead's life is like. He will give the man one thing: he's incredibly good at staying away from the media. Even on the crevices of the internet, there was only pieces here and there that mentioned him as an underground hero. He had acquired his scarf in his 2nd year. He was an extremely effective hero since graduating from UA, and he was currently a teacher at UA. He had only found that out since a Reddit post from an annoyed student said his homeroom teacher, Eraserhead, had expelled him on the first day. Pretty harsh, but based on the guy's posts after, Izuku could tell he was a major cyberbully and misogynist. So it was deserved. So Eraserhead is an elusive soul who has kept himself in the shadows for 2 decades. Therefore, Izuku must make up everything about this man's personality. Preferably, making him more repulsive so Izuku didn't have to feel bad about his plan to ignore his existence. so he made him hate cats and the sun and joy. He moved away from his thoughts as he entered the mall. He hadn't ever liked this place. Whenever he came he had to hide and try to not get caught as he stole much-needed clothes from the most populated stores. There was money in his pockets this time around, but he was more than reluctant to part with it. "Watch it." He apologized as he accidentally ran into someone's shoulder. Another reason he didn't like this place was the two bright lights that took up the little vision he had, that only got worse because of his sunglasses. He wished he didn't have to wear them, but too many questions got asked when he takes them off. His ears ringing as he walked through the boisterous building. His super senses became a curse in this hellhole. His hands balled in his pockets as he scratched deep into his fingers every so often to keep himself from mentally flying away from the feeling of too much plaguing his every limb. He was here for a reason. Get out. Quick and easy. He can do this. He walked straight to the biggest clothes store he knew was here. His mind focused on one foot after another as he kept his head down and bobbed and weaved through the crowds of people walking by. Apologies leaving his mouth from time to time when his reflexes led him astray, and he found himself nudging into others. Manners were one of the few things that stayed ingrained into his mind after all these years. The store was big, much too for the 10 or so workers manning it. Of said 10 workers, 3 were teenagers just wanting the extra money. Another 5 were young 20 to 30-something people just trying to work for a living. There was also a nice little old lady who gave him a chocolate bar when he first came because he was skin and bones. He likes her. Then there was the 40-year-old guy. Izuku had seen him sleeping on the floor a few times in uniform. How he isn't fired yet is beyond him. But the point being that the workers didn't notice him taking an extra shirt here and there as long as he was polite and quiet between shouter number 4 and screamer number, so he waddled in as the wave of air conditioning washed over his face, and he bolted straight for the clearance section. They were getting into winter now, and so the summer clothes would all be hung up to dry for prices he can actually afford. Izuku's size fluctuated depending on how much food he could snag that month, but as a general rule he steered towards the kids' sections. They were normally comfier anyway, even if he had to deal with dumb motivational quotes and rainbows on his shirts. He had one too many cat shirts than he liked to admit. He kept a quite slow pace as he looked out for something that would work for the fox character he wanted to make. It's not like they had a Vigilante section, so he had to get creative. He already had the stolen fox mask to keep on wearing if it ain't broken, don't fix it, so the outfit was the big problem. He only really knew of 3 vigilantes if you don't count the hero killer, and he wasn't going for the all-might superfan, pop idol or homeless man look. Even if he was homeless, he didn't want to announce it to the world. That would just cause him more issues. The clearance section was a little dry today. He kept sifting through clothes in the hopes of finding something at least fox-related to keep on theme if he couldn't get something helpful to be wearing outside at night to fight crime. He really didn't want to have to steal the whole outfit from the more expensive aisles. It's less suspicious if you buy at least one item. A soft, surprisingly expensive fabric caught onto his hand as he looked through the pile. He ripped it up from its home and was met with a black leotard. It was for a 10-year-old, so it would probably fit him even through his weight fluctuations, although his vigilante roof jumping may put a stop to those due to the extra steps, and the soft fabric wouldn't annoy him if he had to turn the touch sense up. The pure black color would make it easier to stitch up if he got injured. He's not as worried about the clothes helping him to not get as injured as he is about fixing them if when he gets stabbed through it. His body is resilient, and the black will help hide the blood. He put the leotard into his arms and crossed them across his chest. He wasn't going to steal it, it was the cheapest thing he was going to get, and having it on display would make him less of a target if one of the workers decided to catch on. There wasn't anything pants-wise in the clearance section, so he resigned himself to having to steal some from the more expensive sections. He maneuvered himself from the relatively underpopulated clearance section over to a sign that said, "Men's," and, sadly, it was filled with men. He kept his head down and moved over to the pants section. Izuku was quite a lot shorter than a lot of these guys, but what can he expect at 4'11"? He'd get his growth spurt soon, okay? He realized his mistake as he combed through the men's section, that he was much too short for these clothes. Any pants that fit him around the waist went below his feet and off on the ground. He was most likely going to get a tool belt to hold. things for him which could be used to hold the pants up, although he was going to have to cut the bottom to around his ankles. Izuku didn't have many shoes because of the annoying extra joint in his foot, but he was fond of the steel-toed boots he had stolen from a department store at 12. They weren't technically necessary thievery, however they help a lot to give him extra height. Little wins. He sighed before deciding upon a pair of cargo pants that were only a few inches longer than his legs. The extra pockets would help, and they seemed breathable to run around in. So he took himself to a small corner he knew was a blind spot for the cameras and balled up the pants before stuffing them into the waistband of his sweatpants. He rolled his hoodie back over it before beelining over to the cashier. He kept his head up as he moved forward. His favorite old lady was on shift as she waved to him, and he waved right back. There was a few places he had to go after this, and truly he just wanted to get this whole excursion over with. His isolation these past 2 years has made him less liking of social interactions than he cares to admit. The speed walking continued through the store when his eyes caught onto the softest-looking coat he had ever seen. It was a dark green and more of a trench coat if anything. The inside was filled with enough fluff he would probably sleep in the thing. Even with the vision of a blind bat mixed with a moth mixed with a cavefish and any other animal with sheet eyesight sometimes, he caught on to stuff just using his eyes. He did need a coat. It was heading into winter, then it would be snow season. If he was still doing the vigilante gig by then, he would be freezing in the leotard. He did quite like the thing, but it didn't have sleeves. He would rather not freeze to death. So the jacket was necessary, obviously. He would have to ball it as much as he could to put it into his waistband with the cargoes. He was far too deep in thought to even notice as the old lady snuck up behind him. "You like that one, dear?" She spoke softly, staring right at Izuku's tinted eyes as she did so. Izuku let out a very undignified squeak at the sweet old lady's presence. Loud chuckles left her lips. Stares from other customers caused heat to flush to Izuku's cheeks. He would need to pay more attention as Fox and probably train harder if he could get that scared from just an old lady speaking to him. "Oh yeah, sorry," he mumbled when he realized he had gotten caught. He really wouldn't be able to steal the dumb thing now. He just had to pray she wouldn't pry on the slight lump in his hoodie. He moved to put the coat back, but his hand was swatted away as she looked at him disapprovingly. Now, child, it's getting chilly and you need a coat." She shook her head and took his hand. He then found himself getting dragged over to an empty cashier lane. The shop wasn't that busy right now. Still, he felt bad for skipping the queue. She took the leotard and jacket from his hands and scanned the leotard. Izuku did not want to think about the price of that jacket. He well and truly could not afford it. He was poor as sheet, okay. He just wanted to try and get a good meal before going out. Nothing can go his way, can it? He looked up with much remorse to check the price when he heard the infamous rustling of the bag being acquired and then was confused at what he saw. It hadn't increased from the price before with just the leotard, but the jacket was stuffed into the bag. He had to lean closer to the machine to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. The old lady told him his total with a knowing grin on her face as she put one finger to her mouth with a slight shush. Izuku had to hold back tears as he mouthed, "Thank you," and dragged his hard-earned stolen cash from his pockets. The world really didn't deserve people like her. Izuku didn't deserve people like her. He wanted to help people like her. A smile came to his face as he let himself get lost in thought. It's easy to forget in the day-to-day the good in the world. The people who are kind and compassionate and selfless. The people who Izuku was not, but for whom he would be happy to lay his life down for. He took the bag and waved at her as he left the safety of the underpopulated store with pop music playing overhead to find himself yet again in the bustling horror that is a mall. Has he mentioned how much he hates populated areas? Because he hates them. A lot. He pulled his hood back up and relied solely on his hearing and the foggy mental map of the mall. He had to find the sporting goods store. He moved the cargo pants from their hidden spot in his waistband into the bag he was holding when he was sandwiched into a particularly large crowd. His hands held on tightly to the bag strap, the rough texture giving his hands something akin to rope burn, before the skin flaked off and rearranged to make itself brand new without a second thought. He stumbled at the sharp stabbing pain in his hand before getting himself under control. Forcing himself to think about the walking, the store, The anything to not think of the pure squeezing and stabbing agony just under his chest. He would need to snag some food on the way out of here. He hadn't had anything since that stale beef jerky. If he wanted to really be a vigilante, then he'd need to make sure he was eating enough to at least function. Passing out in the middle of a fight would not be fun. He took slow steps around the sporting goods store to try to calm the swimming of his head and to erase the black dots creeping into his tiny field of vision from the endless abyss which covered most of his view. He allowed his hands to snag a few protein bars and shove them into his pockets when people weren't looking. Small luxuries. He even let himself get the expensive brands even if they tasted like sandpaper. Food is food. One benefit of being able to manipulate his own senses meant that if he didn't like a certain food, he could just turn down the sense and not even be able to taste it. Of course, that meant another sense had to be increased while he was chewing, but you win some, you lose some. All his senses were enhanced to some degree normally anyway because of how bad his eyesight was. He hadn't been able to find a way to fix it in the 2 years he'd been on his own. Every time he tries to turn up his sight, his head just started to feel like someone was drilling into it from the temples with an industrial-grade jackhammer. He always ended up sobbing and curled into a ball in his bed fort as he tried to ignore the pang of loneliness when he realized no one cared he was crying. Silent tears falling onto no one's ears, as he was the only one to know they were even there. That he was even there. He hit his hand against one of the metal stands to heave his mind away from the memory. They weren't needed right now. Right now, all that was needed was him getting his newly decided weapon of choice, a baseball bat. It was basic, however it would work good in hand-to-hand fights. He knew basic self-defense, but beyond that he only had sheer will to hope he didn't get stabbed in the head multiple times on the first night. That and the thought that if God wanted him dead, he'd be on the side of a curb by now. He thought about getting a metal one, but that left more risks of serious injury. He wanted to be able to regulate his attacks, and he couldn't if they found their brains splattered on a wall after one hit. The aim of being a vigilante was to save people, not get himself wanted for being a murderer. He decided on a pretty basic-looking baseball bat. It was probably meant for the little leagues as it was a lot smaller than the others, but it worked to his favor because of his height. He gave it a practice swing and it worked quite well. He swung by another few aisles to make himself look busy. In the third of the 7 aisles held the packs of the knives. Moving quickly through the aisle as he took 3 packs of knives and 4 switchblades, and they all found themselves safely in his bag, pockets, or waistband. People need better security, really. He paid the exhausted-looking young man at the counter, who looked like he'd rather be dead than here right now. Izuku found that was a commonly held sentiment between retail workers. It worked in his favor, though, if they couldn't be bothered to check if the boy who bought a baseball bat really only had a bat on him. He was happy after that outing that he could leave the mall. The hardware store he planned to visit was technically part of the mall, but you had to go outside to get in. He counts this as a win. His smile came back to his face as he got back under the sun's rays. The knives were moved into his bag and added the protein bars on top. He scarfed down one of them as he stood, trying to recollect his energy before going back into a store with people in. His hand found itself moving to his hair. He would probably need to cut it soon. He had given himself semi-regular trims over the 2 years he had been on his own. Apart from that, he just let it grow. The memory of his first day out on his own was still painted over his mind. He was practically bald back then, and how terrified he was at the thought of being alone. He had embraced it now, though. The calm of being by yourself all hours of the day was unmatched. This vigilante gig would probably mean he ran into more people but small interactions he could deal with. He ran his fingers through his badly cut mullet, far overgrown after his miserable attempt at giving himself cool hair. He had been on his own a while, hadn't he? Time flies. He moved slower than usual over to the hardware store, the smell of cardboard and sawdust assaulting his nose as the automatic doors opened. Izuku was quite fond of this place, even if the smell was truly awful. He often came here to get different metals or tools for whatever his build of the week was. The best form of entertainment when you're too scared to leave your house. He already knew what he was here for. He had seen it a few times while coming through. There wasn't any excuse he could think of to really need it. He didn't like stealing from meaningless objects, but a fancy tool belt required for him to be a vigilante was plenty excuse. If only that logic worked on cops. It wasn't anything too fancy. A dark orange like Izuku's stolen fox mask, as well as having a loop that would fit his baseball bat and multiple pockets for his knives and whatever other stuff he decided to carry with him that day. It was perfect. It was Fox's. Fox already has a thieving count of 11 now, fingers crossed that doesn't have to increase much more. He wrapped the tool belt over his upper stomach and put his hoodie back over it. Izuku not getting caught more for all the stealing he's done is honestly a miracle, all things considered. He hated getting caught for things, always shoved him into a fight or flight response he didn't want to deal with. He didn't come here just to steal for Fox. He had looked over the tech he got from the villains the day prior. While the parts there would help him with fixing his radio, he did still need to get some more copper wiring to replace the burned out ones. With his budget, he should be getting aluminium wire, but copper worked way longer and was more flexible. As well, he's a tad traumatized from the time he used aluminium wire, put it in wrong and almost blew up his apartment. You live and you learn. About 10 minutes later, he was walking out with 4 pounds of copper wire and his tool belt still sat snugly under his hoodie. Sometimes he loved being tiny, let him stay out of sight more. Like if you saw a 6-foot man sat alone on a park bench looking through his bag of knives and baseball bat, people would be suspicious, but when little Izuku does it, no one even bats an eye. It's extremely helpful. Being smaller would probably help him out as Fox too. Little demon running around and hitting villains over the head with a baseball bat before running away could be a funny sight. A child's laughter floated through the air from the Mizudafu Park next to him. He had used to go there when he was younger. When he was weaker. Izuku had most of his life turned upside down at 4. Then at 5, the remnants were put carefully into a plastic bag before sending them into a meat grinder. After, the pieces were picked up and shaped into the image of another person he was meant to be a pale imitation of. He picked up his bag and walked back to his apartment with a smile haunting his face. He was going to help people. Use up the last ruins of his life to do something useful. He doesn't know how long it may last. Though, in this moment, as the sun shines down on him, and he's surrounded by happy people unaware of the true horrors plaguing their world, he's free to do what he wants. He had highly underestimated how cold it would be out here. He had a 3-hour nap after getting back to his apartment before running around and trying to find something to do until midnight. Then about an hour later he had found himself jumping across rooftops with his hands wrapping the even more fluffy than he thought it would be coat around himself. He would be a much bigger fan of the outfit when summer came around. The leotard fit him well, but he did have to cut off the turtleneck bit of it. His cargo pants sat around his hips and he rolled up the bottoms of them so they sat over the top of his boots. His tool belt was wrapped around his waist and in it sat 2 knives he could throw, a switchblade for emergencies, a protein bar which was probably already mushed, and his baseball bat. It was, surprisingly, not swinging around that much as it sat firmly at his side. That was helpful. He was worried about it moving about and inhibiting his running. Since he was 11, Izuku had been sporadically learning how to jump across rooftops, just for fun really. Being alone all the time gets boring. He has gotten pretty good at it over the years. He hasn't even hurt his ankles yet from a bad landing. He calls that a win. Getting ready to jump across a much larger gap when a muffled cry came from the alleyway below. There was a man with floating hair being held at gunpoint by a guy with a mask on. He was whispering to Floaty Hair to give him his wallet or he's gonna shoot. Pretty basic threat, but originality doesn't always come from desperation. He moved his baseball bat out of its holder. He had done a few practice swings back in his apartment. Hopefully a person's head isn't too different to a wall. Jumping down to the floor of the alleyway with much regret as he landed on his ankle wrong and heard a crack from underneath him as his ankle snapped. He spoke far too soon. Maybe he should have practiced how to do that properly. The wince he let out as his ankle started to heal alerted the mugger of his position. He swung round to hold the gun up to Izuku's face. He still had his hand over the other man's neck, and if it wasn't for the gun and the terrified expression on the victim's face, he might have taken this interaction as something less child-friendly. "Who the hell are you?" The mugger's voice came out gravely and forced, like his voice didn't get used much. Perhaps his quirk inhibited his voice. Perhaps he just didn't speak much and smoked 10 packs of cigarettes a day. Who is Izuku to judge? He opened his mouth to speak when his voice got caught in his chest. A large coughing fit erupting in his throat as the words got stuck and refused to worm their way up no matter how hard he tried. What? Cat got your tongue? His voice came out more sly, less gravely, like the more he stood there making Izuku's voice disappear the more the smoker voice effect disappeared. In fact, his voice got higher, lighter, more childlike. More like his voice. Izuku is no stranger to talking to himself, but hearing his voice come out of someone else was a strange feeling. So he's a villain who can't speak on his own and can only speak when stealing the voices of others. Izuku was praying he got his voice back after this. He couldn't deal with never being able to speak again. Learning sign language would be such a pain. He listened out for the man's heartbeat. It was absolutely racing. That was going to be annoying to tune out while fighting him. He had made a last-minute decision before leaving to wrap his training BLNDFLD around his eyes under the mask. With the mask snuffing out most of his remaining eyesight, he had decided to just go all out and put on the BLNDFLD so he could completely tune out his vision. He listened into the man's bloodstream running through his limbs. If he could keep on paying attention to that, he could tell when the guy was moving and when. He still remembered the first few days when he lost most of his sight and had new ways of fighting drilled into him until he could barely stand. Izuku ran forward and swung his bat at the mugger's head. The mugger dropped the man who he had pinned to be able to duck and weave his swings better. Now without his hostage though, he started to get more desperate. He tried to kick out Izuku's legs from under him as he once again slipped backwards to evade a baseball bat to the throat. Haven't seen you on the news before. What kind of hero are you? Not one at all. Can't tell you that though because you're currently yapping using my voice, a-hole. He must be new to mugging if he still thought all heroes operated on TV. Underground heroes were normally the ones who operated at night, out of the public eye as they dealt with low-time criminals. Sure, underground heroes weren't that well known, but people still knew they existed, right? They aren't that dumb. His inexperience in fighting was shining through as he continued to flail about in an attempt to duck and weave and escape. Izuku had to run towards the entrance of the alley every few seconds when he kept on trying to escape. He was slippery, he'd give him that, but his form was god-awful. He had attempted to throw a punch, and if it had connected he would have likely broken his thumb. Izuku was not the best fighter by any means, although he knew the basics of combat. They'd been drove into him since he was 5, after all. A sloppy roundhouse kick was sent to his head. The guy was very desperate. He had a cool quirk, but it had no combat use, and he seemingly had no combat experience. He was doing this out of unbridled desperation and anger. Izuku understood where desperation could take you. He's not innocent to thievery. But his victim was curled against the wall. He looked around 17 and terrified. The gun which was just to his head was being waved around like a toy. Izuku had never hurt anyone unless they tried to fight him. That was the small, shallow, and flimsy moral compass he kept close to his rotten, cursed heart. Some people called him a hypocrite, but lines must be drawn in the sand. A wall of glass to keep himself from his father. As the kick came close to his head, he pushed the leg to the ground using his hand before stomping on it with his boots. In the moment of shock as pain registered through the mugger's body, Izuku swung his bat at the man's head too quickly for him to recover and duck again. He heard his body drop to the ground, and he quickly realized he had forgotten to get stuff to restrain the villains. Well, this is a trial and error, isn't it? He kneeled down to the villain and put him into the recovery position so he would be okay while unconscious. Yes, he was annoying, but causing a death is a bit much for a vigilante on day one. He hadn't heard the bone crack in the villain's leg, so hopefully he wasn't too injured. He kicked the gun the man was holding into the side of the alleyway before moving towards the teenager and kneeling down next to him. You okay? He tries to speak as softly as he could to calm down the teenager. He had his head hidden in his shaking hands and was refusing to look up. Izuku felt bad for him. He remembers when he was a little kid before everything happened and he would cry openly at every little thing. The kid was technically older than Izuku, but he was still mentally a child. Izuku grew up far before his time. He didn't want that for anyone else. The villain is down. I don't know how much longer he'll stay like that. Izuku was mumbling his speech as he stayed kneeled next to the kid. I'd really appreciate it if you called the police. The kid's head moved up at that. Aren't you a hero? Can't you do it? His words stuttered as they came out. Like his words had to be forced out through layers of anxiety and fear. Would Izuku have turned out like this if he wasn't taken by them? Izuku bit the inside of his cheek. The kid was already scared, and telling him he was scarcely saved by some weak vigilante doing this because he has nothing else to do would probably terrify him more. He just let out a nervous laugh. Izuku couldn't see the kid's face, and yet he could feel that his hands had started shaking again. Maybe this was a bad idea? Call the police. His words still came out stuttered, though now they had more force behind them. Good, because Izuku didn't want to deal with getting the police here. He would have to figure out a way to restrain the villains and alert the police of them being there in the future if he was going to keep on being Fox. Izuku nodded at the kid and stood back up. He considered jumping back up to the rooftops, but the snapping of his ankles every time he jumped down wrong wasn't very appeasing. He would learn how to jump down properly eventually, but for today potentially staying on the streets and staying vigilant of nearby heroes was a good idea. Giving the villain another kick to the head to make sure he stayed unconscious before running out of the alleyway, Izuku was gone with the wind. The faint buzz of the streetlights overhead told him where to stay away from whenever he passed a hero. There were only about 3 out tonight from what he could tell, and one of them was Eraserhead. Izuku had made sure his patrol route stayed far away from Eraserheads, and it's always good to be careful of the other heroes too. He could theoretically deal with the likes of Death Arms if he had to, but he really didn't want a name for fighting heroes. As well, if word got to Eraserhead that a kid running around in a fox mask was beating up heroes, he might decide to take matters into his own hands. Then he's a tad screwed. Unsurprisingly, muggings were pretty common this late into the night. 2 girls walking home late linked arm in arm that Izuku saved had ruffled his hair after. That was a strange experience. Then there was the guy in full suit, who after Izuku stopped him from getting mugged started shouting at Izuku for something or another that he couldn't understand, and then Izuku realized he was just drunk and his words were slurring together. All in all, the night was pretty slow. Izuku hadn't really known what to expect, considering he barely went out at night, but at least his biggest injury of the night was a snapped ankle. He calls that a win. He found himself back up onto one of the rooftops. His legs crossed on the edge as he ate the very mushed protein bar he had in his tool belt. It was times like this he remembered how free he was, and God, he loved it. No one to hold him back or tell him how to behave. Just Izuku Midoriya, the vast, never-ending sky, and the world below his feet, too far out of his reach for him to care. That was until he heard a scream from said world down below. He jumped at the sound and choked on the protein bar in his throat. He attempted to silence his coughs into his shoulder. He had to keep his position a secret until he figured out what was going on. Dust coated his hands as he crawled to the other side of the roof to listen out down below. He kept himself knelt down to try and hide out of sight. There was about 5 guys total down there, and one was hanging out behind all of the others. One of them had massive hands balled into fists that did not match the rest of his body, and another had crab claws for hands. The other 3 were still bulky, but they had no outward signs of their quirks. Their victims were a couple in their mid-30s. The guy was shouting that he didn't have his money yet, over and over again as his friend was being held by the throat. She was likely the one who had screamed. Well, Izuku, can't leave this one much longer. Don't suppose I can, but in here, a soft voice spoke into the alleyway. She had a tall stature and pretty bulky body. She was standing in a way which hid her muscles and made her more petite-looking, more vulnerable. Who are you supposed to be, lady? The voice came out extremely patronizingly from the man with the girl's throat in his hands. This guy was getting further and further down the respect list whenever he moved a muscle. A laugh left the hero's mouth before she spoke. You'll see. About half a second after the words had been let out into the air, she had rushed forward. A knife was stabbed into the man's wrist and caused him to drop the girl. The new arrival that Izuku was starting to believe was a hero and he should really be running right now, caught the girl with ease and let her down next to the man who she came with. You could do much better, girl, the hero deadpanned before going back to fighting the 4 guys, and Izuku had to hold back a snort from his vantage point. They all tried to ambush her at once, but she just seemed content to fight them off with all the grace of a ballet dancer. Her moves seemed fluent, like it came naturally to her to be able to fend off multiple assailants at once. Izuku was taking mental notes of her form. If he wanted to get better, he would have to learn from the pros themselves. There was one problem though, the fifth guy was still held back behind the others. He took slow steps towards the hero, and despite all her strengths at fighting 4 villains at once, she didn't even hit the fifth guy once. It didn't make sense really. The hero knocked down guy number 3 and the fifth guy was right next to him when she did it, yet she didn't even acknowledge him. Did he have a quirk which allowed him to not be attacked? To not be seen? It would line up with everything, him not being used to intimidate the guy and his friend before, as he couldn't be seen anyway. He was here purely as emergency backup in the event the heroes came. It would be a perfect quirk for an ambush. You take down the villains, and when you think you're safe you get whacked in the head by seemingly nothingness. He was getting closer to where the hero was stood, about to finish getting the fourth guy down, and his body just moved on its own. He hadn't even been planning on using his darts tonight, but desperate times and all that. He lined up his blowgun to where he could hear breathing coming from and shot it out towards the invisible man's neck. It just so happened to skim by the hero's neck and caused her to whip her head around to look up at him. For a moment Izuku thought he was truly and without a doubt screwed. All those 2 years spent under the radar and alone, and his first day doing something enjoyable, he gets caught because he had to play the hero. He could probably still run if he was quick enough, lie low for long enough people forgot that a kid in a fox mask ever even existed. Then the villain let out a shout. A gasp came from the hero as she stared down at the ground where the fifth guy was laying. His heart rate was indicating that he was unconscious, and from the way her head remained on the ground for about a minute afterwards, Izuku guessed he became visible again. That would help his case. Trying to incapacitate a hero and saving a hero would probably have much different reactions and jail times. A loud laughter echoed throughout the alleyway as the hero wrapped her arms around her stomach. She was finding this situation far more amusing than Izuku was. He wanted to run as soon as he shot that dart, but something kept him planted to the ground. Maybe it was his own self-destructive tendencies that kept him close to the hero he almost shot a poisonous dart at, or maybe it was his own stupidity, they'd never know. "Thanks for the assist, kid." She shouted up at him from the floor, her hands were on the sides of her face and imitating a megaphone. Was she not going to race him up here and arrest him? Sure, he had helped her, but he is a vigilante, isn't he? What he's doing is illegal. Yet she's just giddily trying to talk to him. Izuku waved back slowly before moving to put his blowgun away. Probably a dumb decision, as it was his only way to quickly get the hero down if she quickly switched faces and decided to go after him. However, he kinda wanted her to trust him. His hands were shaking as they opened the pockets on his tool belt for the blowgun and darts. How nervous was he at meeting one hero he hadn't even heard of before? He needed to get his act together. "The name's Phantom, by the way." She shouted up at him again. Her words had a softness to them that even Izuku couldn't overthink into maliciousness. He really didn't get it. Was she just going to let him get away? In seemingly reading his mind, she turned her back on him and spoke into her comm about catching 5 criminals, seemingly no mention of the child vigilante on the rooftop who had helped her. She started handcuffing the villains, and Izuku could feel the couple's eyes on him from the ground, but surely if Phantom wanted to catch him she would have done it already? Surely she can handle a little flack for not catching a vigilante as new as him? It's basically her fault for turning her back on him like this anyway. So he ran. Izuku ran across the rooftops and let the wind fill his lungs and throw his hair back into the endless abyss this world resides in. He couldn't even help another laugh erupting from his lungs as he got across a particularly long jump unscathed. He was loving it. He had gotten seen and within a few feet of a hero. A hero who could easily have ran after him and tried to, or even successfully arrested him and ruined his framework of a life. Yet she didn't. He liked this Phantom. She was nice and evidently pretty lenient on vigilantes. Which in his case was a massive plus. Were other nighttime or underground heroes like that? He didn't want to push it too far too early, but maybe after a while of being Fox he could try talking to a hero. Maybe they could even be allies. God knows Izuku needs some relationships in his life, no matter how surface level they are. He could deal with that another day. It was edging on 3 a.m. after all. He was only planning on doing another run around of the city before going back to his apartment. He rolled onto a rooftop after a big jump as he heard a shout from down below, another mugging presumably. Wiping off his inappropriately large smile before getting closer to the alleyway, he jumped down to the ground with his bat swinging. Hopefully, one day people could know that no matter what, there was a fox there trying his best to protect them. For now, though, he could help people. That's all he ever truly wanted. Shoyuta was exhausted. That could describe his mood most days. After that godforsaken kidnapping the day prior, he had to do an ungodly amount of paperwork. Then Tsukachi only decided to mention to him after he had done all of it that he had to do even more because of the fox vigilante who decided to show up. The problem child, because that's what he was, a child, had been the only one to notice the kidnapping going on, as it was out of the way in a residential area. When he saw the little kid running around the streets incredibly fast, crying his eyes out, Shoyuta thought he was a runaway. Then he started rambling through his tears about a kidnapping and a warehouse and a gun to his head. Shoyuta had pointed him in the direction of the police station, then ran as fast as he could towards where the kid had described. In the warehouse he had found absolute chaos. They must have noticed the kid's escape as they were trying to get the other 5 victims out of the warehouse, and the vigilante the kid had described was hiding behind some boxes. He thought the kid was trying to stay out of trouble. Maybe he had been kidnapped with the rest of them and had got free. Then the kid recklessly threw a knife at the villain's gun and stupidly started fighting him. The kid had forced Shoyuta to fight the rest of the kidnappers as he dealt with the one actually willing to shoot him. The fox was seemingly trained in combat, but he was obviously rusty. His moves seeming like second thoughts instead of basic instinct, like they were forced and added on instead of learnt and gained to his skill set. The tarp story was one he very much wished he could have omitted from the report, as he had his eyesight covered, and his own capture weapon used against him by seemingly a young teenager, if that. But darn his integrity, as he had to add every annoying detail to his statement and try to ignore the pointed grin on the detective's face as he read it. He had even had to come in the next night after his patrol to fill in even more paperwork about the incident. It was times like this he regretted his career choices. He was currently sat waiting his 11 billionth document about the event, a cup of coffee, with a totally normal amount of sugar in, nursing in his hands when the police station's door was slammed open. Shoyuta turned his head and saw Phantom waving over at him. Phantom was a relatively new underground hero. She had graduated UA 3 years ago, and while he wasn't her homeroom teacher, he certainly knew of her. After getting her license, she had swarmed towards him. "Hey, Eraserhead. I got some news for you." She had that practically immovable grin on her face as she slid into the seat next to him. Shoyuta just rolled his eyes at her and begrudgingly took the next form from the detective. "What is it, Phantom?" He tried to speak as dismissively as possible so she would go bother someone else, like Miss Joke. They had always been close. "I saw your little vigilante today," she announced very loudly to the whole station. Maybe that was just her normal volume. Shoyuta wanted to crawl into a sleeping bag and never reappear. The kid had had a headache the first time he met him. If he started going out every night, he could already feel the migraine coming on. "You saw the fox?" He couldn't hold back the curiosity in his voice as he spoke. His eyes moved to glare at that stupid grin she seemed so sure on keeping up. "Yep, he even shot one of his lil dart things." She mimed holding the blowgun up to her lips, then an explosion as the dart hit its target. Very overdramatic. The darts had only immobilized the villains, and while he hadn't seen the fox actually hit anyone with them, the stories of the witnesses lined up. The kid had shot 3 people with darts, 1 in the eye, and the poison on the tips was still being checked by forensics. So far, the running guess was he mixed different types of poisons together. Shoyuta would be lying if he said he didn't find that impressive. What was he doing? The detective had joined the conversation, his eyebrows furrowed in curiosity as he opened his notebook. Phantom sighed at the impromptu investigation. "He was helping me. I didn't notice one of the villains I was fighting had an invisibility quirk, but he did." She always spoke with her hands. They made large gestures whenever she spoke to emphasize her words. The excitement flowing out of her body whenever she did so. She would have made an amazing spotlight hero. She was almost made for the media and attention. This could be bad. If he's getting into fights he could get hurt, Shoyuta said. Didn't peg you for such a softy, Eraserhead, Phantom interrupted as she nudged his shoulder. Not wanting brats to get hurt is my job, he pointed out as his capture scarf knocked her away. He seemed to be handling himself, she replied with a shrug. Still, we will need to keep an eye on this, Tsukachi started, putting an end to their bickering. Phantom, Racerhead, if you could both try and deter this fox from any more vigilante work with words first, then we might not have to try and use more force. Shoyuta nodded with most of his face still hidden in his capture weapon, and Phantom gave him a mock salute before starting to fill out her own paperwork for the night. Shoyuta sighed as he looked at the pile of papers still left to do. If it stops more paperwork, I'm down. I'm a detective, not a god. Tsukachi laughed as he left the heroes to their own devices. He looked at the vigilante form Tsukachi had cobbled together when he mentioned the vigilante at the kidnapping. At the top there was 3 columns left unfilled. Shoyuta had hoped the kid's appearance was a one and done, that he'd run along home and stop bothering him. Sadly, the world didn't work in his favor very often. Alias, Fox. Presumed age early teens. Danger level, low. Izuku tumbled out of his bed the next night with such joy plastered on his face, he could almost ignore the soreness erupting all over his body. Turns out running around all night does not make your body happy with you in the morning. He had found that out when he first woke up after his first fox night with every muscle screaming at him. He hadn't felt anything the night before, but he chalked that up to the thinning adrenaline high he rode to finally finishing fixing his radio. Nothing got done the day after but eating protein bars and lying motionless on his couch, the radio he'd newly fixed playing Present Mike's radio station in the background. It was all that was on, okay? Now, though, the screaming of his muscles had been silenced almost completely by his precious, amazing, and he'd never complain about it again, regeneration quirk. Over the years, he had figured out that his regeneration quirk chose to tackle injuries on their level of severity and by how much energy he had to spare. So his relatively harmless soreness, coupled with his recent protein bar-filled diet, meant that it had taken all day to heal. He stuffed some of his cash into Fox's tool belt. Hopefully he could get some time to buy food tonight. The protein bars were starting to get scarce. His BLNDFLD was wrapped around his eyes, and then the mask was strapped onto his face. He thought of bringing one of his notebooks around. Analyzing quirks has always been his favorite hobby even after the memory of it was tainted with years of it causing harm, but his handwriting would be even more awful if he tried to write down his thoughts with only the feeling of ink to guide him. He would have to just try and sort through his thoughts in the moment, praying his muttering habit didn't get him found out. He couldn't ever really get that habit out of him. The 2 years of isolation truly didn't help. His hands stopped on the doorknob out of his apartment. If he kept walking out of the front door as Fox, one of the cameras could pick him up. If he got seen on a camera, he could get traced back here. If the police started getting annoyed at his unending vigilantism, they could track him back here. They could realize who he is. Then he'd be so ever-loving screwed he'd wish that falling off a building actually did do permanent damage to him. He looked over to the window. In the 2 years of living here, there was only a hero in this area once in a blue moon. He really wouldn't be noticed if he started jumping out of his window to the rooftops. His neighborhood had seemingly been forgotten by the world. The closest, legally, inhabited homes were only on the outskirts, and the rent was so cheap some people took the stigma of living so close to where the Muzudafu earthquake began with pride. Izuku knew the earthquake started somewhere around here, where exactly he didn't know, but it's not like Japan would get one of the worst earthquakes it had ever seen in the same spot twice. Besides, Izuku Midoriya was already pronounced dead from the earthquake, so it was kind of like fate if he did actually end up dying here. The cold breeze came in through the window and disrupted the normal temperature he kept in the unheated apartment. A sigh left his mouth as he realized he would have to hide in his pillow fort tonight to try and warm up. Maybe he could set a small fire with his lighter to get some heat back in. He stepped out to the outside of the window and shut it behind him before jumping to the next roof. His foot slipped on the edge of the roof, and he threw his arms out to get a grasp of something to stop him from plummeting to the ground. Luckily, his arms stayed on the edge of the roof, and he was able to crawl his way back up in a less than flattering position. When he finally got up, he laid on the roof of the building and tried to catch his breath for a few minutes. So he needs to lessen his confidence. He shook his head and sat up with a frown. A stinging pain laid itself across his chest from where he hit it against the roof. He let out a groan and forced himself up despite the pain. It would heal itself eventually, and he wasn't going to let his dumb little fall hold him back before he even got out. Running across the rooftops luckily didn't lead to any more falls that night. The first one had been embarrassing enough with no one even watching. If a hero had run into him when he fell, he might have just found a way to circumvent his regeneration to be able to die and never be seen again. He had to readjust his baseball bat every so often while running until he finally realized he had put on his tool belt too loosely. Idiocy is just his normal state of being sometimes. He stopped to sit on the edge of a rooftop and discarded his coat under him to fidget with his tool belt straps when he heard voices from underneath him. There were two of them walking side by side as they spoke. Their heart rates were slightly elevated despite there being no visible danger around. His legs swung back to hide on the rooftop as he listened to their conversations. "I have to get back to my patrol route soon, or the partner is going to get mad, Rocklock." The person on the right spoke quietly as they fidgeted with the cuffs on their arms. "Oh, he's screwed." Also excited. His emotions are out of whack right now. Rocklock was one of the few heroes who patrolled this area at night. He had a really cool quirk. Being able to immobilize inanimate objects could be extremely useful, especially if it could work on clothes or even hair. Being able to lock someone in place could surprise them enough, and they wouldn't even be able to tell until they were already down for the count. Izuku could think of about 20 different uses for the man's quirk, and he was currently a few feet below him on the ground. The other hero he was with left soon after they'd spoken, and he hadn't even noticed until Rocklock spoke. "Who's up there?" he shouted up from where he was standing below the roof. Izuku's hand slapped onto his mouth. He must have been muttering his thoughts without even trying. He was going to start strapping something over his mouth to stop himself from muttering again soon. It worked when he was younger, and if he were a silent vigilante, he could live with that. He laid there in silence as seconds turned into minutes that felt like they stretched into years. The hero seemed unfazed as he stood there with all the time in the world and leaned against the wall of the building Izuku was hiding on. Izuku could try and run away and pray that Rocklock didn't follow him. He was thinking over his options when he heard a car speeding down the road a few miles from where he was. The car being exactly on the far too high speed limit didn't worry him, but the mumbling of someone in the trunk did. What's up with him and running into kidnappings? If he gets caught because of a kidnapping, it would all go full circle. He sat up and grabbed his blowgun. There were only 2 darts left in his pouch. Here's to praying his aim is good. He heard Rocklock trying to speak to him as he shot out his dart towards the car window, shouts coming out from the man in the car as he started to swerve. Izuku stood on the edge of the roof and ignored the protests of the hero as he took a risky jump over to the hood of the kidnapper's car. He felt his kneecap slide out of place down to his shin as his other leg's tibia cracked under the force of the jump. His wrist was mostly shattered from how he landed on it, but he was expecting much worse from that jump. He muffled the wince with his uninjured hand to try and make himself seem scarier in the moment. Very unnecessary, as the kidnapper, aka the only person who could hear him, started screaming his lungs out when he landed on the hood. Well, that makes his life easier. He used his bat to shatter the glass of the windshield and put the uncovered part of his face into the inside of his elbow. Getting glass out of skin is really annoying. The driver jammed on the gas pedal and continued swerving to try and get him off. Izuku latched onto the inside of the dashboard to stay on as he was thrown about. He felt bruises blooming on his front and the itching sensation as they healed themselves despite his low energy. The burning of his legs as they tried to heal themselves filled up the few thoughts in his brain that weren't fueled by adrenaline. He reached out with his uninjured hand and slammed the driver's head into the steering wheel. Blood leaking from the driver's forehead started staining Izuku's hand as he threw him back onto his seat. Glass from the dashboard stabbed into his leg through his cargo pants as he slid into the passenger seat. He took control of the steering wheel and realized, far too late, that he had no idea how cars work. He kicked the driver's legs away from where the pedals were, kicked down onto the pedal closest to him, and let out a very undignified squeak as the car sped up. He moved onto the pedal next to him and was relieved as it started to stop, for about 1 second, until he got very bad whiplash and hit his chest against the glass-filled dashboard, letting breath seep in and out of his bruised lungs for a few minutes until he forced his injured arm to reach for his last protein bar and scarfed it down with a groan. He sat back in the car seat and tried to ignore the feeling of his skin rearranging to fix the injuries that could have killed another person. Pain evaporating from under his skin as it's replaced with unchanged and unharmed cells. Any evidence of the pain he's gone through disappearing without a trace, as he's left with only the memories of torture and burning that he has no way to prove. Does his pain even count if it dissipates in mere moments? When he felt the burning sensation start to be numbed under his chest, he sat up and listened out for Rocklock as he slowly moved towards the car. "All right, get out of the car slowly with your hands in the air," Rocklock shouted from a few feet away from the car. Did he not know that the driver was passed out? How would he get up right now? Wait, he's talking about Izuku, isn't he? Oh, he's messed up, hasn't he? From Rocklock's perspective, he literally just attacked a random man for no reason. If it ends up being that the breathing body in the trunk wasn't actually kidnapped, then he's going to kill someone. Speaking of the body, Izuku could still hear breathing and a very elevated heartbeat from the trunk. Muffled screaming and kicking onto the walls of the trunk very much pointed towards a kidnapping. This arsehole better thank him. He moved his arm into the driver's pocket and took out the keys, unlocking the car before throwing the keys back at the man's face. Rocklock stood close to the other side of the car as he kicked open the door of the car, wincing as he walked over to the back of the trunk. Rocklock ran round to the back of the car to stop him from running away, and he put his hand onto his shoulder. He was probably worried about the number of injuries he sustained throughout that whole thing. A fair worry if it wasn't for his inability to be injured for more than a few minutes. He put on a probably very annoying grin as he grabbed the door of the trunk and pushed it open. Rocklock gasped as he saw the person inside the trunk, his head whipping between Fox and the person before laughing as he patted his shoulder. "Good work, kid," the hero spoke in a slightly softer voice, and Izuku had to bite back a smile at the approval. He has a reputation to keep up here. Rocklock started untying the victim and trying to comfort them. Izuku took the opportunity to sneak away. It had rained that day, and he had to move carefully to not slip on the puddles left on the ground. Izuku hated rain. The last time he had a good memory with rain, he was a 4-year-old in a rain jacket as his mom held his hand and laughed as he jumped in puddles. Memories of rain pattering against windows as he lay alone and cold in his apartment, or rain becoming a burden on his shoulders as it relentlessly beat down on him before he had found his way to shelter. Then there was the first time he had tried to run away from his father. The sight of cherry mixing with the colorless water overhead and tainting it, staining it, taking over its very image until it was all you could see. That was one of his last memories of full sight. The rain was quickly replaced with the 2 hands. 2 cursed hands with all 5 fingers down on his eyes. He miscalculated his jump and landed with 1 foot in a puddle. The water shot up and then covered him in muddy water. He wrapped his coat around himself again and walked on with his head down. His cheery grin was replaced with a blank frown as he attempted to hold back the shivers. If he got a cold from this, he was going to find a way to fly and strangle a cloud. All the clouds at once. Droughts are a little price to pay. He dragged himself to the nearest fire escape to get himself up to the rooftops again. The few people around at this time had started whispering about his wet dog appearance, and it was starting to annoy him. His legs screamed out underneath him as he forced himself up the stairs. When he finally got to the top, he ended up just lying on the roof with a frown. His energy had just been zapped out of nowhere, and it was annoying. He slapped himself and tried to focus on the stinging pain to get himself back to this existence. Out of his blank and welcoming mind and back to the tiring and uncaring world. He let out a groan as he heard a scream in an alleyway a mile away. What is he doing? He is being given the chance to be good and help people, and here he is complaining and being a brat. Who cares if he wants to go home? Who cares if he wants to sleep? He's been fine being lazy the past 2 years as he sat apathetically in his fortress of solitude. The people he needs to save probably want to go home too. He can let them do that. Maybe if he saves enough people, he can be seen as useful enough to make up for his years of inaction. He shook his wet hair a few times to get it to dry before jumping over to where the scream came from. He forced a grin on his face and leaned on his muscle memory to fight the villains trying to hurt other people for selfish reasons. If he broke an ankle when jumping from the rooftop, smashed his wrist in a bad fall, or got his head bashed in during a fight, then it's better him than a real hero. The victim he saved hugged him when he made the villain fall and thanked him profusely. A real smile came to his face again as he heard the victim say she isn't hurt. He tried his best to comfort her, and somehow his stammering over his words got her to calm down and be able to stop crying. She patted his head again and agreed to call the police as he ran off to go save someone else, then another person, then another. His few energy stores were depleting as he regenerated over and over again. Adrenaline rushing through his blood keeps him going after every fight. He will be honest, his mind wasn't truly in the present. Swimming in the blank, nothing was too positive a prospect, that his muscles moved without any command to fight the villains. It was pure bliss to not have to care about the eternal burning in his chest or the pain of the scrapes he got in fights. He didn't need to care as long as he saved people, right? He only came back when the victims gave him physical contact, a brief reprieve from his mind vacation as he got positive attention. His little reputation was going through the ringer tonight. "You sure you're old enough to do this, little guy?" One of the men he had saved had kneeled down in front of him. His hand was ruffling his hair, and he had laughter stuck at the back of his throat. He couldn't blame him for laughing, a 6-foot man being saved by a 4'11" little boy who just knocked out 3 men with a baseball bat. It must have been a funny sight from the outside. "I mean, what are you, 12? The man spoke with the laughter dissipating from his tone, replaced with concern. "I'm way older than 12, Izuku retorted. "The fact that he was 13 is not necessary information." "You sure?" the man said. Izuku knocked the man's hand away from his head and shoved a grin on his face. Waving at the men as he heard one of them call the police, he ran as fast as he could down the street. Half an hour later, he was still walking in the shadows of the streets. His limbs were still screaming out beneath him, but he shoved it down into the crevice of his brain where it didn't bother him. Kept shoving it down until it became no more than a frequent whisper. Just a small tug in the back of his head begging him to lie down and give up. No one had caught his attention as needing to be saved in a while. He had been shouted at by some teenagers who were smoking something to do a flip when he was on a rooftop. He humored them. Backflips were just fun to do, alright. Maybe he should call it a night. Running around all night with no breaks would just make him sloppy. You can't be a good vigilante if you can't save people. The unused money sat as an unnecessary weight in his pocket. He really needed to get more food for his apartment. The protein bars were running low, and he didn't want to have to deal with the excruciating pain of healing on no energy. Truly not a fate he would wish upon his worst enemy. Finding a 24/7 convenience store was deceptively easy. Hiding in the alley next to it and checking to ensure there were no cameras, he removed his fox mask and BLNDFLD from his face. He stuffed them into the strap on his tool belt and covered his ensemble up with his coat. The lack of buttons on his coat meant he had to keep his arms around his stomach to stop his ensemble of knives from being shown to the poor, probably very tired, cashier. His face felt far too bare and vulnerable without a covering. His eyes squinted, and he had to wipe away the water that started to erupt from them as the pressure was taken away. He hadn't even gone outside without at least sunglasses on in years. Shoving his hood over his head, he resolved himself to keeping his head down. The gory and disgusting imagery left on his face was hidden the best he could to stop the cashier from freaking out at the mere sight of him. Or worse, the cameras being unlucky enough to have a certain sensei watching through them at just the right moment to catch his face. In his dreams he had grown to be unrecognizable from the 6 years he spent with him. However, in this miserable reality, his baby fat still sat stubbornly on his face. His eyes, no matter how dull or lifeless, kept that childlike shape to them. His limbs are still far too short and yet unmatched to his body in that way before a growth spurt. A growth spurt that was halted from malnutrition that Izuku had done too little to counteract. A soft bell chimed as he opened the door. The cashier at the counter paid him little to no attention as she kept herself on her phone. What kind of weirdo comes in at 3 in the morning anyway? Not one needing your attention, that's for sure. Izuku finds stereotypes quite dumb, yet certain ones fit him eerily well. He forced his legs past their adrenaline-filled high and moved through the aisles, letting the quiet buzz of a probably broken sound system soothe his brain into forgetting the stress of his life. He picked up one of the cheapest chocolate bars he could find and then beelined to where he could see the canned food. A responsible adult had lectured Izuku on how canned goods were much better for a pinch than fresh. They lasted longer, and, what was more important for him, they were cheaper. A genuine smile came to his face as his mental math concluded he could get 6 cans of one of the soups in his budget. That and the remaining 6 protein bars meant he could make it almost a week before having to find some more cash. A day at a time after all. The world's best game of soup Kenjenga was occurring in his arms as he tried to balance them all until he got to the counter, when he heard the bell ring again. The man's heart rate was staggering. It had even shocked Izuku a little when he heard it. There was something wrong with this guy if he wasn't stressed out of his mind. Ragged breaths could probably be heard even without super hearing, as the cashier even looked up as he stood with his feet planted right by the door. His head swung about the store like his life depended on it. Before the worker could get a word out, she found a knife at her throat. Does crime just follow him now? This must be his karma from his negligence. Being given more chances to help people is a good thing, he supposes. The cans of soup were forgotten behind one of the aisles as he kneeled down out of the attacker's sight. The volume of his demanding only increased as the cashier tried her best to get the register to open for him. Izuku is desperate enough to steal before, but this is just uncouth. It's just mean to rob someone at knife point. That could inflict trauma on somebody. No amount of desperation has brought Izuku to that point yet anyway. He always stole from massive chain stores. No certain person with awful memories of him, just inventory going missing here and there to feed or clothe a lonely orphan. Orders were still being stuttered out of the attacker's mouth, and the cashier was getting more and more frightened as her shaking hands were unable to open the register. The fox mask he had grown to love was retied around his face, allowing himself to push down his hood. Being able to hide always helped with his confidence somehow. If he could pretend to be someone else, then he could think like them, like how a smart lone vigilante would think. A lone vigilante with more darts, for example. There was only one left in the far too big pocket. If he used this, then he would have to go searching to try and get more, and it is so exhausting. The last time had been an absolute train wreck. Did he mention his hatred for cage fighting? Especially their ability to rope in a certain 12-year-old just trying to be a messenger boy into trying to fight men 3 times his size. Did he win all the fights that night? Did he win enough that the memory of it is like an addictive daydream he thinks about as he tries to ignore the gnawing hunger possessing his every limb? Maybe. The villain lifted up his arm, the knife getting ready to stab into the cashier's chest when Izuku shot the dart right into the attacker's neck. He fell to the side of the counter, knocking off the rack of lollipops kept on there as his legs started to fall out beneath him. Grasping the end of the dart, he pulled it out of his neck, leaving a puddle of blood behind in its wake on the floor. Like a pin landing on the floor, the dart was almost silent as it found its way to the ground. The only sound was the increasingly frantic breath of the attacker as the poison started immobilizing his body and his head pivoted to stare daggers at the fox that shot it. That hadn't happened before. The darts had just immediately incapacitated whoever got shot before. Was the last one just faulty? Or did this guy have some sort of quirk that allowed him to withstand poisons longer? Did it work with other kinds of medicine? Not the time for quirk analysis, Izuku. Izuku put his arms up in a surrender gesture. No matter what reason this guy had to still be standing after being hit with the poison, he wasn't completely immune. The man's legs were still crumpled, and he was holding against the counter for dear life. If he could stall him for long enough that the poison spread, then he wouldn't even have to attack him. Hey, idiot. His words stuttered out, and he was reminded how much he idiot trash talk. The silent vigilante gig was looking better by the second. Why don't we just take this outside and not harm the nice lady he? He didn't even get to finish his sentence as the attacker used the seemingly last of his strength to reel back his arm holding the knife again and throw it directly at Izuku's chest. The sound of blood being coughed up from Izuku's throat was accompanied by the crash of the attacker finally succumbing to that stupid poison. There goes his last dart, and he still got a knife to the chest. A very deep knife to the chest if the blood coming out of his mouth was anything to go by. That had only happened once before when he got stabbed in the lungs during an extremely long training session at 10. The adrenaline fortunately numbed the probably inconceivable pain as his skin tried to regenerate and regrow around the knife, sticking deep into his skin as the regeneration confused itself at the intrusion. One of the most annoying things about his quirk is that it just messes around with foreign matter, growing and breaking itself over and over in an attempt to heal around it instead of dispelling it, and using his energy to do it. Like second nature, his hand grabbed the hilt of the knife, and he tried to ignore the squelching sound of his blood leaking out from the knife. Tried to ignore the rotting smell permeating from his chest and haunting his brain with its presence. Tried to ignore the feeling of simultaneous emptiness as it left and the scratching of ribs as the knife made its venture out. The cage around his lungs and heart acted as a never-ending maze that just broke under the pressure of going through its walls. The knife clanked against the floor, and his breathing became far too shallow as his arms curled themselves on his chest. The skin on the front of his chest heals quickly and leaves the internal injuries to deal with themselves on the inside. He was starting to regret all those injuries he let himself get before. His limbs felt like they were not a part of his own body. His head felt 1,000,000 degrees hotter. Vomit climbed up his throat and mixed with the blood still coating his mouth. His chest expanded and deflated against his will far faster than he would have liked. The cashier fussed over his body, soft hands bringing him down to sit on the floor, and he was far too weak to stay standing. Izuku Midoriya wouldn't die tonight. He knew that, but he would be in an immense amount of pain as his body destroyed itself enough in a gory attempt at healing. He just had to get up. If only his body cooperated. Turning in a way that caused wailing from his fragile bones, Izuku used his unfeeling arms to crawl his way out of the grip of rest, continuing to crawl until he found his abandoned goods. Ignoring the muffled outcry from the cashier at his movement, he picked up the chocolate bar. He probably looked like a maniac who gets stabbed and then uses his last moments to eat chocolate, after all. Better a maniac than a dead man, his brain helpfully supplied as he continued eating the chocolate without a second thought. He probably wouldn't have to pay for this, right? Doubting the cashier's first worry would be making the stabbed and maybe dying vigilante pay for the food he's eating. Izuku continued to scarf it down, trying to ignore the taste of sugar mixing with the metal in his mouth. Then the feeling of his dry throat swallowing down the chewed-up food like it was sawdust sent from hell. He had to keep his hand over his mouth between bites to stop himself from gagging or coughing it all up. After the chocolate had fully been pushed down to his stomach purely by his will, he discarded the wrapper into the cashier's hands. Pushing away said hands that tried to stabilize him as he stood up, he grabbed the cans of soup from the floor and left them on the counter. The cashier followed him in probably pure confusion as he leaned over the counter to get a bag to put the cans in. "The police will be here in a minute. I told them to bring an ambulance." She spoke softly enough that Izuku almost didn't notice how much trouble he was in. When had she even called them? Probably during his "I can't breathe" meltdown. He can't do anything about that, except scramble to get out and get far away enough to not get caught. He would need at least half an hour more to regenerate before he would be able to go home. His head wanting nothing more than to fall onto some hard concrete and not wake up for 10 years probably would make him lie there for longer. "I'll be fine." His voice came out increasingly raspy, the word sending him into a coughing fit, which he leaned onto the counter for. The attacker's unconscious body was underneath him as he tried handing over his last bills for the soup. "No offense, but you just got stabbed," she started, her hand rubbing circles on his back during his 7 billionth coughing fit of the night. "Keep it, take more of the soup if you want." Well, Izuku is not one to look a gift horse in the mouth, as he took his bag of canned soups and added about 8 more into it. Absolutely overkill, yes, but hey, starvation does mess up your brain. He doubts some canned soups will really be cared about in all of this. It's not like they're going to waste either. Izuku is unequivocally a charity case, so it's going to a good cause. Izuku could hear the sirens starting to get closer to the convenience store, and with all the finesse of a giant, he dragged himself and his bag of 14 canned soups to the door, ignoring the worries of the cashier as he moved further away from his place of stabbing. Stabbing always hurts way worse than other injuries. So did gunshot wounds. It probably had to do with the fact that his body tried relentlessly to heal around the foreign object instead of just dispelling it, getting the wound into an endless cycle of healing and then breaking again as the weapon stayed stubbornly in its place. Bullets were so inconvenient last time. He had gotten lucky it was so close to the outside of his skin. He wanted to think about what would happen if it had gotten stuck deep inside his chest. It would probably still be in there as he lay in pure agony, unable to move from his couch. Regeneration has its downsides sometimes. Luckily, he was able to find a fire escape when his legs had started to give way and dragged himself up to a rooftop not too far from the convenience store. The sirens were still within earshot for a normal person as the police cars pulled in. He really should run further away. His exhaustion was still in full force, and his heart was starting to get upset at the amount of adrenaline spikes. If he stayed here, then he might get noticed by a hero. Even if they didn't want to bring him in, he's still a child vigilante who just got stabbed. His blood was still rotting on the floor of that store. Luckily, he had gotten all his DNA wiped from any police database years ago, yet the thought of them having his blood just didn't sit right. Maybe he could steal it back eventually. If he could get himself up from where he was currently lying on the rooftop, ignoring the funny scratching feeling of his lungs regrowing under his ribs. That would probably take a while. Likely, there wouldn't be a hero coming to an attempted robbery. The villain was already down for the count, and there was no one else to fight, if vigilantes don't count. So it wouldn't be too bad if he just lay here, right? Yeah. It would be fine. Eraserhead didn't know what to make of the recent vigilante. He was a reckless child who got himself into extremely dangerous situations, got immensely injured, and yet somehow carried on like it was nothing. Aizawa isn't a stranger to denying medical attention, but when you're falling about 20 feet onto a moving vehicle, Rocklock had regaled that tale to the whole station, you can't just run away and be fine. The fox obviously had little regard for his own life, seemingly willing to trade it to stop others from being harmed. An ever-growing, extremely annoying trait in vigilantes. The fox was probably in a rough place, using vigilantism as a crutch to keep going. He didn't even have to meet Fox more than once to know that. Fox had only been active a few days, and yet he should already have enough injuries to put any pro out of commission. Which only led Aizawa to question his quirk, maybe something that made injuries less harmful. He had thought about a self-healing quirk, but the quirk registries say the last person with a kind of quirk strong enough to sustain the injuries the fox had was long dead. So that was scratched off. No matter what the kid's quirk was, getting stabbed in the chest is, by all accounts, very fatal. The sheer amount of blood he had left behind was staggering in and of itself. From the security tapes he had asked for, it seemed the knife went fully into his chest. It was horrifying. A small child doing what he thinks is right gets stabbed so deep it probably punctured his lung and immediately flees the scene. Even if he was a complete and utter problem child, no one deserves that. He had left the scene to go searching for the fox not long after. Tsukachi told him in no uncertain terms to take a walk due to his anger bubbling over as the cashier described how she just let him leave. She let the not even 90-pound, soaking wet, stabbed, bleeding child just leave. Aizawa didn't know if he had expected her to drag him back or stop him from unraveling the knife from his own chest, but she could have done something. He knew he was probably being harsh. Children dying is a sensitive subject for any normal person, especially so in his line of work. Jumping across the rooftops, he begged whatever was above that he wouldn't find a dead body on the street. Maybe if he was quick enough, he could get him to a hospital. He just had to be quick enough. Bile climbed up his throat as he saw the fox mask attached to a curled-up body a few buildings down from where he stood. He took a risky jump to the next roof and ignored the sharp sting through his leg when he fell on it wrong. Fox. His hands were probably shaking as he reached out to check his pulse. Due to the way the fox was curled up, he couldn't see if he was breathing. His feet sped up more and more as he got closer, his breathing speeding up to accompany the overexertion plaguing his muscles. What if he was too late? He thanked every single thing above that allowed the tension in his body to decrease tenfold when the kid's head shot up. The DMN problem child was thankfully alive. Now for mission number 2. Get him to a FENG hospital. Fox, you're okay, he tried speaking in that comforting tone he used when his students got overwhelmed. Times like this he wished he patrolled with Hisashi. You're going to be okay, you got injured. He noticed how Fox started crawling away from him on the roof, ready to run. He noticed how his hand was shaking over where his stab wound was. He noticed how his other hand was gripping onto the plastic bag like a lifeline. He noticed how Fox's legs were basically limp in front of him. He noticed all of it. Yet it didn't stop the brat from hauling himself up and into a fighting stance anyway. Aizawa had guessed the fox had somehow figured out his quirk after their first encounter. Probably a secret slipped in some internet backroom. He knew he had to cover up Aizawa's eyes to stop his erasure from working. Any movement that closes his eyes makes his erasure slip, and if he can't see you, he can't erase anything. It was annoying and he would have to ask him how he found it out, but still there's nothing he can really do while bleeding out on a rooftop. Words tried to leave the fox's mouth, but they were replaced by his dried blood being mercilessly coughed up. It looked extremely painful as the fox almost doubled over in pain and had to force himself not to. Aizawa moved closer to him and started rubbing his back to help with the coughing. Then, in a move that made him question if he was actually in pain, his arm reeled back from his chest and punched him square in the nose. Aizawa staggered back in pain and saw the fox stumble away towards the edge of the roof. Then he made a mistake. In his panic he fell back on his reflexes, and he turned on his erasure. His hair floated up into the air, and he could see it in all of its agonizing glory as the fox collapsed over his own feet. A guttural scream from the very pits of hell itself was let out as he fell. The banshee scream only lasted a few seconds, but it seemed to stretch into hours as Aizawa forced himself to blink to stop whatever torture erasing this kid's quirk inflicted. He lay there for a few more moments, ragged breaths escaping his still injured lungs, followed by sobs that made his scream seem like child's play. Then he noticed how deep crimson blood was spilling out of his open mouth. Sobs only increased as he started choking on the blood that refused to stop pouring out of his gaping mouth. Aizawa had to hide his nose and his capture weapon from the stench of rot that the blood was starting to give off as it continued its relentless assault from the boy's own insides. What kind of quirk did the fox have if it had this reaction on its body to being erased? Maybe the quirk hasn't caused this. Maybe the quirk just allowed him to sustain injuries easier, and by Aizawa erasing it, he had made all the kid's injuries attack himself at once. Bile returned to its endless crawl up the chasm of his throat. Aizawa was horrified. He had caused this suffering. This kid needed a hospital. Aizawa slowly trudged towards him. The fear of erasure accidentally activating again spurred him into blinking far more than a normal person does. Never mind him. He could only hope the fox didn't take this as an invitation to never trust him again. It's impossible to get anyone, especially a child, to open up if they don't trust you. Listen, Fox, I'm sorry. Even with the softest voice he could muster, Fox still tensed up at his voice and swerved around in a way that could not be good for his lungs and swung his bat right at his face. The handle became drenched in blood as the waterfall continued to cascade from his mouth, only starting to subside moments later. He ducked out of the way of the bat and knocked it away with his capture weapon as it landed into his own hands. The fox was obviously in fight or flight mode, not wanting to listen in the midst of his panic attack if the quick and ragged breaths between barrels of blood leaving his throat were anything to go by. Before he could get another word out, the fox made a split-second decision. Taking advantage of his mistake of standing right by the edge of the roof, he wrapped one arm into his capture weapon, the other grasping his arm, and he pushed. He was deceptively strong under those scrawny bones as Aizawa went tumbling over the edge. His hands grasped onto the blood-stained bat as he fell. He saw the fox mask looking over him. His blood was making its last stand as it dripped from the fox's mouth directly down onto his eye, causing him to blink. When his eyes opened again, he was gone with the wind. And he kept on falling, his capture weapon his only hope to stop his descent. He was so unbelievably doomed. The menace in the fox mask. Unconventional methods? Or something much more deadly? The edge of the roof was really calling his name right now. The article had jump-scared him when he logged onto his computer. Apparently the most important story right now was his vigilante identity. Front page showed a grainy security camera photo of him in the convenience store right before he shot his last, very precious, dart straight into the villain's neck. Luckily, it had been that photo and not one from before he put his mask on. He just had to hope that the cameras didn't get any footage of his actual face, or he could be in some deep shit. Running away from Japan was his original plan. He stopped because of all the legal barriers stopping a supposedly dead orphan from fleeing the country. Maybe those non-legal options were still there. He flicked the side of his head. This wasn't the complete end of the world. It was likely he was going to get some sort of attention eventually, he just hadn't expected it to be this soon. He had expected to get a few weeks out of helping people before the media started picking him up, but, sadly, his luck is never that good. The article contained snippets from 2 interviews. The first was from the cashier he had saved the night before. They asked her a few questions about the attacker first. Did he think he was going to kill her? What did he want? Did he seem like a threat? That sort of thing. She answered most of them with short responses, barely acknowledging the knife he had to her neck. Maybe it's a trauma thing. She didn't want to think of how much danger she was in, so she didn't. Easy as that. Then she started talking about him. Her previous aloofness disappeared as they asked about the vigilante who saved the day. The reckless college student, as she put it, was helpful, yes, but also just escalated the situation more. She spoke about how the man was just a delirious drunk the police could have taken care of, and then he showed up and shot him. She didn't mention it was with a dart, and got himself stabbed. Well, he was upset. He had gotten himself stabbed and nearly caught by the eraser hero. The thought of that fight spiraling in his head by the stench of his decomposing flesh just below his nose, his eyes, his hands, everything gone into one large pile of decaying bone. You can't make everyone happy, he mumbles to no one in particular as the words scratch about his still dry throat despite the gallons of water he chugged to try and get the taste of red out. He hasn't spit out that much blood in years, since when his illness first arose from under the now empty pile of stolen quirks. Scratching at his increasingly reddening throat, he continued to scroll through the article. His eyes were squinting and watering under the strain of being on his computer for hours already. He hadn't even slept the night before. The fear of what if was plaguing his every nerve. That and the pain of a lung ruptured twice in one night were howling at him. The article clearly didn't like him, going out of its way to frame him as the bad guy over and over again. Every attempt to help someone that they knew about was twisted and changed until he was the one on the evil side again. The bastard fox, who destroyed everything around him, cloaking his sinful ideals in a shade of help. They were pretty on the nose there, he couldn't lie. He didn't want to hurt people. Is that all he was doing? Some people may say the vigilante has good intentions. Intentions are misleading. I'm sure Stain has the best of intentions as he slaughters our fallen heroes. Our martyrs. Oh, he doesn't know what to say. Everyone who spent a day on a Stain forum knows he started as a vigilante. He's the cautionary tale of when you let justice go too far. When the lines between vengeance and bloodthirst weave and whirl around together until it's impossible to untie one from another. The knowledge that whenever another hero falls from that cursed katana, he thinks he's doing good. He thinks he's making the world better. The worst part is he can't deny it. Stain's ideology of false heroes is one that resonates somewhere deep into Izuku's soul, so that if you tried to remove it, you would have to take every moment from his childhood with it. Every memory of laying in pain on a harsh cold ground surrounded by villains and begging, praying for a hero's help, and yet none coming. Then there were the worst memories. The good ones. The ones where a villain put a band-aid on a scraped knee. When a villain patted his head and told him how he loved him. Where he sat in a villain's lap as he got told a bedtime story. When he sat beside a villain without a care in the world, because that was his brother. Izuku grew up in the belly of the beast. Watching and listening as heroes, no matter how high in the rankings, fall from their own hubris. Like how Icarus fell from the sun, heroes falling to the darkest means to gain what they want, always more. It's never enough. Standing still as fire engulfs their cities and the man who causes all of the world's chaos laughs down at their SBM. It's infuriating. Was he like Stain? He hadn't killed anyone as Fox. But he had hurt that criminal in the car a lot. He hurt a lot of his criminals badly. His poisons, while not fatal, were still agonizing to feel in those split moments before black enveloped your mind. It could be counted as torture if you looked at the attacker in the store. He didn't really hold back. Did he? They had even gotten a few words from the kidnapper in the car. His screaming as the Fox jumped onto his car bonnet, breaking his glass and knocking him unconscious. The article skimmed over his crimes and sprinkled in the supposed crimes of the kidnappee. According to this, they were rival gang members. According to this, they were just as evil as each other. According to this, he was the one causing all of this chaos. He couldn't even disagree. The Fox mask sat cold on his blood-stained chest. His hair sticking up in ways that probably wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for the blood coating his hands working as a sort of gel to help his hair defy gravity. The eye bags under his eyes looked as prominent as ever as his mind begged him to rest. He continued scrolling on. It was basically a slander piece. Well, is it slander if it's technically true? It wasn't even bending the truth too far. Just laying out facts in a snide enough way to make Fox look like the true villain behind all of his nice attempts at being good after all these years. The thought wormed its way deep into its mind and made itself at home there, curling up onto his brain and riddling his body with even more guilt that made him want to get rid of his stomach's contents. Contents that were mostly a can of soup. A can of soup that he really couldn't afford to get rid of. He shut off his computer. Small bubbles of water were leaking their way to the surface of his eyes. His knees came up against his still injured chest. The Fox coat was still wrapped around his shoulders. Despite the blood staining his hands and clothes, his coat stayed miraculously clean even with the constant downpour of scarlet from his lips. His face had been washed off the blood, but the feeling of it still lingered in the back of his mind. A phantom pain of overwhelming fear as the nothingness came back. He didn't know how Eraser had found him. Izuku was curled up in agony as his body healed his lungs from the inside out, barely paying attention to his surroundings until he heard that godforsaken voice. Yes, he freaked out. He was hurt and tired, and his only means of surviving could be wiped away in an instant with one look from this guy. That doesn't mean he expected him to actually do it. Maybe he was a pest. If the heroes were willing to almost kill him, then he must be doing something wrong. His antisocial tendencies must have been permeating from him. Maybe they just wanted him dead. Currently there are only two men who could do that, one who thinks he is dead, and one who Izuku is ready to really avoid like the plague. Izuku knew he wasn't going out that night. It was far too soon. Even if his body didn't rebel at the idea, heroes like Eraserhead could be looking for him. He didn't really think he was important enough for full-on search parties, but he doubted he would be able to slip away from heroes without a fight anymore. 3 days of being a fun vigilante was really all he got. Maybe he was cursed or something. Something must be the cause for his astronomically bad luck. Or maybe it's just him. He's also never heard of someone making as many problems as he had. Definitely cursed. The curse of Eraserhead. His tool belt discarded on his couch looked almost bare without the bat in it. He could have grabbed it from Eraser before he fell, got pushed, off that roof. Sadly, his mind wasn't in the position to do anything but be paralyzed in fight or flight. He knew from the split second in the warehouse that losing his quirk could be grueling. Yet his most concentrated daydreams paled in comparison to the real thing. The last real memories of that roof were locked away deep into the vault of his head. He really only remembered blood-stained hands gripping onto the scarf and pushing in a vain attempt to stop a feeling that the owner had long lost his control over. Everything else was gone in a maddening self-preservation instinct that his own blood loved to torture him with. There's a reason Izuku always asked about what happened to his mother. If that didn't make him an atrocious person, he didn't know what did. His own morality, a long worn-out subject of his one-man debates, he let his perception slip back to his lack of weaponry. He should replace the bat soon. He would only have 2 if he went out as Fox again. It wasn't an outrageous thought, going back into his own isolation. Having survived this long, he knew he could last a long while longer. Most of his near-death scares in the past year came from his newly found Fox hobby. He was going to think about it. Indecision ran rampant in all of his choices up to this point anyway. He had, more times than he liked to admit, thought about giving up this dead charade and running back into his father's arms. Hoping beyond all reasoning that his dad would still be anything more than cold, decomposing bones turning to dust. He needed a walk. Yeah, he just needed a break. Just needed to get his mind off the thought of the purple mist engulfing his body. He let cold water soak into his blood-stained hair, waking him up slightly as he worked his fingers through it to get the tint of red out. Shoving his shaking hands into his hoodie pockets, he stepped out of his steel-toed boots into his favorite and only other pair. The red shade of them had become his main outfit color over the years. All the other shoes he tried to wear would pinch his foot in the weirdest ways. He got these shoes long before running away. Half convinced they were going to get him tracked down, he tried throwing them away only to find nothing else worked. Maybe his father did something else to his bones to make Izuku more reliant on him. Hiding his non-existent complete and utter shock at the thought of his father literally changing his bone structure to keep him with him, Izuku finally opened his apartment door. Glass from a broken window down the wall was strewn about. Maybe he could get some boards for the windows today. He had a tiny, and his mind heated up at the thought of it, amount of money left. Ignoring the probably villainous job on his horizon, Izuku continued on his eerily silent walks through the street that once had children running through with bright smiles on their faces. Replaced almost overnight with cracks in the ground spreading miles around and a national trauma so large that the area didn't even have much graffiti. He forced a very selfish smile onto his face. He didn't have to worry about getting caught. He was able to be completely alone. He was able to get away from his father. He was able to have such selfish thoughts without weary side glances from peers. He was perfectly happy. He sneaked through the back of the closest populated house to find the path the small, closely knit neighborhood had made to stay off the cracks, which dominated every square foot of the land. It was still mostly silent, but there was an air of domesticity that was eradicated further in. A crayon drawing here, a lost tennis ball on a roof there. A loud laugh that could be heard through the walls, and people didn't even care enough to tell them to shut it. Izuku was more thankful for his sunglasses every time he walked through here. Then as he got back to the main city, he wished more and more he had brought earmuffs instead. One of these days he's going to bleed from his ears instead of his mouth. Even with miraculous healing, throughout the night he would have to sit up as he kept on coughing and coughing until small splatters of blood showed their faces again. He rubbed at his ever-growing eye bags in an attempt to wake himself up. He kept up his bob and weave technique he had perfected for when he's in public, with his head leading the way to get around the far too crowded street. His arms were discarded as they wrapped around his stomach to try and stop himself from doubling over from the unending complaints from his body in general. He shared a lot of the complaints from his head. The constant banging against his skull with a hammer that any minuscule social interaction brought him being one. He'll walk around the city, maybe hop on a train, and just get his mind clear. Easy as that really. Maybe he should just get used to his life not being easy. Muffled cries sneaking their way into his solace from deep inside an alleyway. Curse his eagerness to jump into danger. He didn't even realize he was at the head of the alleyway until he locked blurry eyes with one of the people in the alleyway. His head swiveled around to get a view of the other attackers in the alleyway. There was about 4 of them. They all wore a black school uniform, probably middle schoolers. From what he could see of them, he guessed they were a bit older than him and a lot stronger. As the other child, who looked around his age, could see as he was curled up on the ground and getting his side kicked in. Another muted sob left from the boy, and Izuku finally noticed how he had some kind of white cloth wrapped around his mouth. What kind of assholes were these guys? Hey! He shouted down the alleyway. It may have been his nightly escapades, but his heart didn't even miss a beat as all 6 heads turned violently to face him. Who's this? The one who was kicking the boy on the ground stopped for a moment to whisper to the boy next to him. No idea, replied boy next to him. Then the probable ringleader started laughing as he grabbed a fistful of the boy's purple hair. "Ah, did you get yourself a boyfriend, mind freak?" he remarked with a grin leaking into his voice. The rest of the group started laughing like the sheep they were. It was annoying the hell out of Izuku. A scowl set deep onto his face. He reached onto his hip and realized far too late that he didn't have his bat. Or his darts. Or any weapon he could use on these guys. He had a knife, but stabbing someone is not ideal, no matter how awful they are. He wasn't even in his fox suit. He was in a ragged old hoodie and sweatpants he got from a thrift store. More importantly, he didn't have his mask. He didn't have something to hide behind like he normally does. It's just him. He could probably fight them with his fists if they didn't spring a knife on him. Bullies like these are all bark and no bite with fights. Using the strength in numbers to team up on one vulnerable person and praying no one fights back. Except he is weak right now. He's not Fox, an apparently agent of Chaos Vigilante who brings destruction in his wake as he tries to help. He's not even Izuku Midoriya, whatever he is from beyond the grave. He's just Izuku. Izuku Shirakumo. He freaked out when he first got arrested and they asked for his name. Izuku, who hacked government databases to add himself into existence. Izuku is weak and cries when someone accuses him of stealing. Izuku is probably a fleeting, worrying thought in a detective's mind as he gets dragged into his station again. Izuku can't fight these guys. Not if he wants to keep his weak cover. He braces for a punch without even meaning to. Flinches a second language to the boy who grew up on eggshells around a man who considers himself a god. "Wait, no, he's shaking," one of the boys from the sidelines pointed out and all but beamed with joy when the others started laughing. This was getting sad even for Izuku. He thought he was talking about the purple-haired boy until he put his hands together. He wasn't scared of a bunch of teenagers, was he? Maybe he was just scared of not being able to fight back. The ringleader dropped his hand out of the purple hair and stood up straight, leaving the boy to bang his head on the floor in response. Now he was either very tall for his age, or Izuku was just far shorter than he thought. He cracked his knuckles, then his elbows, before moving on to his neck. Bit overkill, but okay. He was stalking forward with an almost insane grin on his face. This did seem like the kind of guy to have a knife on him. He had that, "I'm not afraid to murder" look about him. "Come on, pipsqueak," he started with a laugh as his fingers started to elongate into knives. So he was right, huh? As he got closer, Izuku could start to see him properly. That murderous smile was even scarier up close. Izuku, though, also couldn't see anyone else due to his far too large to be a natural figure taking up his tunnel vision. "You were all brave before," he finished as he pushed Izuku's chest with one finger. A wave of "ohs" passed around his entourage before being silenced as he whipped his head around. "Cowards!" He did not mean to mumble that out loud. "Can he have that cloth the other boy has in his mouth, please? Or a different one, actually. It's probably unsanitary." He could have sworn the ringleader saw red before reeling his arm back. Luckily, he had the foresight to know that stabbing someone in the face wouldn't be a good idea. He would have regenerated, yes, but it's hard to answer the question of how after that. Didn't mean the punch felt any better. Stumbling back, he felt his front tooth get knocked out of its place. Luckily, he could get his hand over his mouth to disguise it as the tooth got back into place. Blood getting on his hands again, making them shake even more, didn't change anything. He looked up at him from where he stumbled back. His body language was open. He could easily knock him right in the neck and then slam his head onto the ground when he doubled over. The others didn't seem like the types to fight back when something like that happened to their leader. It would be so effing easy for him. Not for Izuku. He dragged his legs down, who were oh so happy to comply as he brought himself to the ground. The floor was annoyingly wet. The ringleader spat on him with another grin on his face as he kept his head down. "Come on, I'm getting bored." The ringleader spoke, and the sheep oh so happily complied. There was an alarmingly large amount of glass shards on the floor. Grab one of them, and at the right angle he could have cut someone's trachea out. A good cut to the neck, and they would be down for the count. Easy as that. He grabbed a pretty sharp shard and felt blood bloom in his palm as he held it before closing up again. It would be almost too easy. Freak spat out the last of the bullies as they left the alleyway. Dropping the shard onto the ground, Izuku used his hands to drag himself back into a standing position. His legs weren't really a fan of working today. At least his cover is intact. He was having a bad enough day already. He moved his head towards the purple-haired boy, his hair the only discernible feature in the dark alleyway. He had untied the white cloth from his mouth and was coughing quite violently as he held his stomach. He was still on the ground, sitting on his knees as he was still doubled over. Probably from the pain of getting kicked so many times. Izuku had to be more thankful for his regeneration sometimes. It might have been Izuku's horrible eyesight, but he was partially sure he saw multiple splodges of red on that cloth, matching the more sprinkles of red as he continued his coughing fit. Blood pouring out of his mouth. A scream so guttural it ran his throat raw. Head blurry with pain, adrenaline, and pure anger at the hero. The deception of a concerned voice scratching at his ears. "You okay?" The purple-haired boy barked out from his side of the alleyway. "Oh, well, how are you?" That is the real question. That looks bad. Izuku wants to say he was exaggerating his awkwardness to play the part. He would be lying. Moving closer to where the other boy was sitting, Izuku could get a better look at him. His purple hair seemed to defy gravity as it stayed upwards and out of his face. Could it have something to do with his quirk? The eye bags under his eyes were larger than even Izuku's were. Did this boy ever sleep? The worst part was he didn't even look bad with eye bags. They seemed to fit his face nicely. Some people just got lucky in life. Izuku's gaunt appearance was one to be ignored most hours of the day. He had gotten far too close in his attempt to be able to see the boy properly, and he had to get reminded of personal space by a push to his chest by the boy. "It's fine," he spoke quickly, the words being spat off his tongue like they were lava. His voice came out a bit more raspy. Either his throat got hurt by the bullies, or he just didn't talk a lot. He hoped it was the former. He had a pretty voice. "If you say so, my name is Izuku. By the way." He stuttered out his name, and now he really wondered what he was doing. Putting a big flashing light over his head by. Telling his name unnecessarily would just cause more annoyances. He hadn't ever cared about socializing with some dumb kid his age before. Who the hell decided to possess his body? Can they please get out before he embarrasses himself even more? Shinso. His name was spat out again as Shinso kept his eyes down to the ground. His hands were twirling and pulling on the hair next to his ear. Well then, Shinso, what was up with those guys? They seemed really rude. He spoke with his signature whiny voice back in full force. God, that was probably so annoying. He felt his cheeks go red from embarrassment. Please, whatever ghost is possessing him right now, take him to the afterlife already. It could be that the knife quirk made him like violence more. There is a lot more expanding evidence that quirk type can affect personality. He only looked up from his mumbling spiel at the end, and he noticed the deadpan look Shinso was giving him. It seemed like he was scrutinizing his soul bit by bit. He must have had some kind of quirk that allowed him to get behind his walls if he was getting this upset over a bad look. "You mutter a lot," he spoke matter-of-factly. No room for niceties or even rudeness. Just saying it how it was. He liked that. The stare Shinso was giving him was even looking less negative the more he stared back before diverting his gaze to the floor. "Oh sorry," he started, the words starting to stutter as they left his lips. "It's fine," Shinso cut him off, waving his hand as he sat up properly with a groan. Izuku tried helping him, but his hand just got slapped away. "You shouldn't have jumped in like that," he scolded. The negative glare back over him, he wrapped his arms around his stomach. Should he have run in without a plan? No, but he could have easily handled himself. He just didn't. Maybe that's worse. "I wanted to help you. Be a good person." It was a flimsy defense. He really hadn't done anything but get the main bully to focus on him and then get bored by his frankly pathetic lack of fire. Or defense. Or anything at all really. Shinso looked back up before sighing as he stood up. Izuku quickly followed him to get on his feet, brushing away the dust and water that collected on his pants. It wasn't too noticeable that he had been sitting in a wet alley, thankfully. "You can go do something else helpful," Shinso spoke with his hands still wrapped around his middle. His fingers tapped onto his arm as it stayed tied with no room for air. What do you mean? Call him an idiot. This Shinso guy was speaking incredibly cryptically. He mulled over every single word, analyzing every syllable before he let them out. It was obvious when his brain was reworking itself to figure out the best way to get his speech out. It was also a bit apparent his dislike towards asking questions. Wonder why that is? Go help yourself, get lost. His words were spat out as the glare came down on full force. Izuku stood in place as Shinso hobbled out of the alleyway. Had something happened to his ankle before he got there? Not like he could ask. Shinso had made that very clear. Izuku's face was pretty red from that whole encounter, and he didn't think he had fidgeted this much since he was 4. So that was mean. Well, he has never needed friends before, has he? He rubbed his palms into his eye sockets with a groan. That had been awful. Letting himself get thrown around had never been a fun experience. Being unable to fight back was always a massive fear of his. He couldn't even do anything. He could have helped if he was Fox, though. Too bad Fox was hated now. The scum on the bottom of some victim's shoes, as he only made violent situations worse. Perhaps you just can't help anyone if destruction has chosen to follow you in your path. Phantom pain of the long-heeled punch resided on his face, making his hand press up to his nose every few seconds to make sure he had actually regenerated. He wondered what heroes like Rocklock and Phantom thought of him now. Eraserhead had probably given up on him now. You don't recover from being pushed off a roof easily. Likely the other two hated him just as much. The small part of his mind praying that he wasn't completely hated by everyone got locked away far away in his mind with everyone else he didn't want to think about. He wanted to help people. He knew that above everything else. Most vigilantes do it because they want to enact their own sense of justice. Help the people they see fit. That was how the hero killer put it anyway. When he puts that mask on, he feels invincible to the world. Like there's a shield of pure light keeping him safe from the dark of the land he resides on. He hadn't felt that way in a long time. His feet started moving before he even realized what he was doing. Fox is far less efficient without a weapon. Throwing his fists around would only get him so far. Getting more knives and leaning into the anti-hero label they wanted to put on him. Then again, stabbing someone seems more permanent in a way. Like he's actually wanting to harm people, and saving someone is just a side effect instead of the main reason. So knives still remain a last resort. His bat was honestly one of the best choices he made. Maybe a hammer would also be good. That might be overkill now that he thinks about it. His brain was working fast enough that he didn't even notice when his muttering started to slip out again. His chin resting on his hand as he maneuvered through the crowd without a second thought. His thoughts were way up and away from the land beneath his head. He felt almost at home whenever he got like this. This was when Izuku felt most like Izuku. When it's just him and an endless thought bubble slowly untangling as he thinks endlessly over a problem. Keeping his mind occupied as his body moves of its own fruition far away from his own brain. Times like this he felt like a careless little kid again. He knew deep down that he couldn't ever give up being Fox fully. Yet he also knew that with increased backlash, working as Fox could be jeopardized. His best bet would probably be laying low, waiting for the hype to fly over, and then when Fox is fairly forgotten from that one article, he can reappear again. Hopefully this time he wouldn't ruin anyone's day again. He could even figure out how to do it right this time. Having flown straight into the sun by being Fox last time is most likely what caused him to fail so spectacularly. This time he wouldn't do that. This time he would know better. An oppressive smell of cardboard and sawdust took over his nose for the second time that week. This store was going to start asking him questions soon. The bat was a smart decision at the time, but bats were also associated with the old Fox. He wanted a new Fox to come out after this. A new Fox that was a tad bit overkill. Hammers weren't that much more dangerous than baseball bats, really. They both could kill someone if swung at the right time. He'd only use it if the villain was refusing to go down. Being honest with himself, he felt a lot more vulnerable now that he was out of darts. Those were his cheat codes, and now they are gone. His darts were his non-lethal way to get someone down, Without them, he was scared of accidentally hurting someone too much. Medical care had made leaps and bounds since the dawn of quirks, but that didn't mean Izuku still wasn't scared of simply going too far. Yet still he picked up a hammer. A claw hammer with a pretty strong handle. He would have much preferred to hit someone with the handle than the actual hammer in a fight. As well, if he ever needed to pry through nails, he's good to go. A weapon wasn't the only reason he came here. He had found out pretty quickly into his escapades that hitting someone until they knock out and hoping they don't wake up until the police get here isn't a very good strategy. So he picked up an exorbitant amount of zip ties as well as a very long rope. Supposedly it was quirk enhanced so that it would tie around whatever it was shot at. It was at a hefty price, and getting it would cost the last of his money. Buying it would be an idiotic decision for him to make. Sadly, he is an idiotic person. Going over his 10,000 rationales for why he definitely should get the rope, he finally gave in and brought it over to the checkout stand. Regret fills his veins and arteries alike as he hands over his very last pieces of cash with shaking hands and a too tight grip. Thanks to the soup thievery, he would last at least a week and probably longer before hunger started getting to him. So he could make it about a week before having to go back to doing odd jobs again. That would give him plenty of time for Fox-related research, most of which will probably be spent sadly scrolling through people picking apart his every action and attempt at being good. Criticism is needed for growth. Or something, didn't mean it hurt less. Moving his train of thought back into the more positive aspects of getting more research done on vigilantism, Izuku moved purposefully and kept his head down as he got back to his apartment. The overwhelming racket of other lives and other breathing and other heartbeats dissipating from a cacophony of too much to a small melody of nothingness. Just his own heart that he had long learnt to tune out. All others being forgotten and erased as he got to his own corner of the world. His corner of the world, which he barely trudged himself away from all week. Fresh air is a limited luxury between hours spent on his laptop and practicing with his new weapons. Hammers are extremely strong. He hit one of his walls with it, and it caved very easily under the pressure. Here's to hoping he doesn't have to hit someone's skull with it. A few other dents joined it on the wall. He was trying to find a way to hit something and cause less damage. The only way he had found so far was hitting with the handle, but holding the hammer by the head was more precarious and uncomfortable. He'll figure out something eventually. The rope actually worked surprisingly well. The first time he shot it out, it latched onto his microwave, and he had spent about 10 minutes carefully trying to unwrap it without breaking it. Then he decided to go into one of the empty apartments on his floor and practiced using an empty water bottle. It took about 10 minutes until he latched onto the bottle properly, but once he did, he started getting the hang of it. By the second day, he could grab the thing he actually intended to grab, and 9 times out of 10 wouldn't knock something else over in the process. Progress is progress, and sometimes taking steps back can help you become better. That was what the endless websites he looked to whenever he started feeling guilty about not being out being Fox said. A small comfort as he lay in his pillow fort staring up at the ceiling for hours on end, mulling over whatever worst scenario came to him in the dead of night of what was happening out there. What he could have done to help. What was going to happen since he didn't. He daydreamed until his eyes finally slumped over. Then he'd get back up and spring from his couch so quickly his brain didn't even have time to dream. That's how he found himself on day 7 of his new solitude. His arms clicked as he stretched them out before he dragged himself to his makeshift kitchen. Putting his can of soup into the microwave, he looked over the last few cans still left there. He'd have to get more soon. He filed that away for later as he started scarfing down the soup. The warm feeling it brought erased any lingering fear from his night worry fests. The shaking in his hands always got better after this. He started slowing down his eating as he scrolled through his feeds. It was a mindless activity he did every morning to make sure the world hadn't exploded while he slept peacefully. It was meant to just be simple. Nice and easy. A can of soup fell to the floor, spilling the few remaining contents onto the hardwood floor. And yet Izuku couldn't bring it within himself to care. From his computer screen stared back an article. Multiple articles. All about one villain attack from a man who apparently had some kind of strength-enhancing quirk. Izuku knew better. Izuku knew what that brain protruding from the skull meant. He knew what the monster not being able to listen to reasoning meant. He knew what those horrific eyes meant. It meant it was one of him. A shaking hand scrolled further down the article as the other came to his face to wipe the budding tears away from his eyes. The water refused to cooperate as it continued to just fall. Izuku thought he had blown up the factory for these things. The original plan was for him to go with them. A boy with his own kind. His stupid quirk had other thoughts. That was how Izuku knew he could come back physically from anything, no matter how bad. It just took more time. Izuku read the article as it called him a monster and a freak and a villain. An abomination of nature that was more man-made than anyone truly knew. The Nomu didn't deserve this. Everything it did was not of its own volition after all. Izuku had spent far too many nights trying to get them to do something, anything, on their own, only to be met with a barbaric laugh from the doctor as the Nomu only got more and more confused. Or scared. He didn't know if it was better or worse that the Nomus were scared. Izuku didn't truly know why the doctor reveled in destroying those people's minds so much. Screams of pure agony filled every wall of that disgusting warehouse as the doctor carried out his experiments with a sadistic smile. It was pure SDSM. Izuku and Kurogiri were proof of that. If he really wanted to add quirks to people to make them soldiers, he could do it without breaking their minds down piece by piece until they're a numb slab. A slab ready to be chiseled by the people he had once called family. Every reasonable thought in his mind wanted him to stop reading. He would only beat himself up over it more. There was only really one thing the Nomu could have done. Cause destruction and mass panic. It was all they could do. Even if he wasn't cursed from birth, maybe the doctor's experiments made him more predisposed to it. Nights of being unable to move for hours at a time as he felt his organs being cut into to feed some insatiable fantasy the doctor had after he got his regeneration. Wanting to find him limits turned into a punishment quite quickly when his rebellion didn't seem to tamper down immediately. They stopped after he learned to behave, but the threat stayed, looming over his shoulders like a very persistent spirit. Yet he stayed staring at it, reading it, wiping away water erupting from his eyes when it got too much and he couldn't see through it. It had killed 4 people. When he finally got to the end, he was a mess of blubbering sobs, half wretched, deep from his locked chest. His knees had come up to his chest somewhere in the middle of the article, and when he had finally shut the laptop down, his head collapsed onto them with a whimper. Violent sobs rocked his body as it stayed curled up in his chair. His tears were falling far too fast for his hands to wipe away, and eventually he just gave up. He hated when his emotions came over him like this. He looked down at the discarded soup can, spilt on the ground, rolled away, and leaving him like everyone else. Logical thinking is truly out of the window. Yet as he stared at the floor of a building he wasn't supposed to be in a city he wasn't supposed to be in a world in which he was supposed to be dead. In a city where his kind had killed 4 of their own and his father had killed 100 more. This was all his fault,